Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. So I figured I would do a legitimate dedicated video to Rhipsalis identification of the entire genus. So here we'll look at accepted Rhipsalis species and reduced synonyms. So caryophyllolese.org maintains a checklist of the currently accepted species names, and this would be backed by basically like a lot of botanical research, like a lot of different sort of botanical papers, studies, journals, etc. So, and a lot of those would include like your most recent phylogenetic tests. So in the checklist, you will find the accepted names as bold like this. Those are what's currently accepted, and then you'll see a list underneath there. And what that list is old synonyms that have been reduced underneath that species. And this could happen for several different reasons. One of the reasons could be because it was reclassified, like maybe it was moved to a different genus. So here you see Periota pachyptera, and that was obviously moved to the genus Rhipsalis. So that is just an old name for that plant. And then here we see that sometimes they get renamed because the original name was not describing the correct plant. And what they do is they take the next oldest name that was used to describe the correct plant, and that is now recognized as the current correct name moving forward. So that is actually what happened to Rhipsalis trigonoides, which used to be Rhipsalis trigona. And then you'll also see that sometimes plants get reduced. And essentially how that happens is like maybe a botanist or a taxonomist came along, saw a plant, and thought that it was a different subspecies, a different species, a different form, and would have given it that name. But then later on, a different botanist came along, or a study, a phylogenetic study or something came along and looked at the plant and decided that no, it's not. It's actually the same plant. And over time, you can see those arguments, and you can see, essentially what the greater community decided. So here you can see some things like common names that you see people throwing out for Rhipsalis pachyptera would be like Rhipsalis robusta or Rhipsalis pachypteriform rubra. And so those are not really recognized by the greater community. They're just recognized as being Rhipsalis pachyptera. Sometimes this can help you, like if you're shopping for plants or whatever, and you come across a name that you've never really seen before, or you really just want to check. Talking to community members and stuff, like they've been kind of upset or bothered by buying things like labeled as Rhipsalis robusta, and then you'll end up with just a totally normal looking Rhipsalis pachyptera, which you already had, or it'll end up not even being Rhipsalis pachyptera, which is even worse. So just an FYI, you can kind of protect yourself by, I think, just familiarizing yourself, or even just looking it up if you don't know whether it's an accepted species or not. So let's talk a little bit about phylogenetics. So what phylogenetics is the study of evolutionary history and relationships of organisms. I want to say that phylogenetics is a science. The nature of science is that it is always evolving, it's always changing. The way that science works is that you basically chuck out an idea or a hypothesis and you say, this is what I think is going on based off of all this evidence that I've collected. And then either the scientific community bolsters that or the scientific community disproves that. The way that phylogenetics works is that they sample all of these different plants and then they analyze all of the data that they've collected. And not every botanist or taxonomist analyzes this data in the same way. And so even among these studies, you'll see that they don't all have the same phylogenetic tree. Also, might come down to like whether or not you're even sampling the correct plant material. Rhipsalis has always been super messed up and super understudied, so you kind of also have to take that into account. I think when I look at the phylogenetic tests, I try to find generally like botanists or taxonomists that work together, that worked for really, really reputable organizations, old organizations, very trusted organizations that have been around for a long time, have huge historical collections, because I know that they have more resources and they have more access to the plants and the history and the material to actually get the sampling correct. But at the same time, when you look at these phylogenetic studies, there is a level of confidence for how confident is this data that these are as related or as not related as you think they are. Sometimes that level of confidence is very low. Sometimes it's very high, but sometimes it's very low. But it is still something to remember that it's not like super duper fact. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind. And don't get me wrong, because it's really the best kind of tool that we have for this. I mean, it is really an amazing tool. So I'm not saying that it's garbage or anything. I'm just saying there's room for error. At the same time, I'm going to say that I took some liberties with this phylogenetic tree, as there isn't a fully complete one at this time. Recently, I realized that the subgenre of Rhipsalis has actually grown. I think it was reduced to 3 at some point by someone, and then now I saw that 1 was added. Now it looks like they're back up to 6. So, or even more than there were before. I don't remember if there were 5 or 6, but anyway, there's a lot of changes because of these phylogenetic studies. So if we come in here and we look at Philarthro-Rhipsalis, what you'll see in here is really the majority of the flat-clade Rhipsalis, all of the flat-clade Rhipsalis actually. And when I say clade, I always say clade when I mean phyloclade. It's something that I've always shortened. It's something that I think in the general community we always kind of shorten, but because I'm talking about phylogenetics, don't get confused when I say clade. I actually literally mean the branch segments. We do see some that are not flat clade Rhipsalis though. So we see some forms of micrantha and we see grandiflora and pittieri. I just want to point out what's happening here so that this makes a little bit more sense. Is when we look here, we see this intersection, and that's called a node. And what that means is that there was a shared common ancestor here that all of these species evolved from. So when you go down these trees, there would have been a shared common ancestor here that would have split and evolved, and a shared common ancestor here. Now, when we get to this one, that is saying that Rhipsalis pittieri's closest relative is Rhipsalis grandiflora. And so now when we go down the other side, we can see there's another node, and then we see this grouping of russellii, triangularis, and cereoides. Now, I fudged this, so I don't know how accurate that actually is. It might not be accurate, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, I think that all we really need to know is that all of the phylogenetic studies had these 5 plants closely related. How closely related is really the question, just that they were very closely related in some kind of tree like this. So do know that all 5 of those at least evolved from one common ancestor right here. And we'll kind of stop there with that one just because I did fudge a little bit. So when it comes down to something like Rhipsalis olivifera would have evolved here. This would have been its closest ancestor, and it would have evolved down a lineage on its own. And then all of these other species that are here would have also evolved back from that same common ancestor. But that means that Rhipsalis olivifera is not really as closely related to any of these as they are to each other. So understanding that and going down now, we can sort of see how closely related some of these things are. So like Rhipsalis crispata's closest relative is Rhipsalis barthlottii. I think I may have fudged oblonga in here actually. I think I may have just put it in there not quite knowing where it belonged, but I do know that it is very closely related. These 3 are closely related. So I did the same thing with cuneata. I'm not exactly sure if cuneata and occidentalis are each other's closest relatives. I think I put cuneata in there and put occidentalis on the outside. But just know that these 3 are very closely related. And I'm taking an assumption with australis because I'm not sure if that has been part of any phylogenetic testing. And then here we see Rhipsalis rhombea and Rhipsalis ewaldiana are each other's closest relatives. And then we see that along with Rhipsalis goebeliana, they all evolved from a single common ancestor. And then here we see that micrantha, the forms of micrantha, of course, are very, very closely related. And then on the outside of that, we see elliptica. So what we see here again is that elliptica evolved from this ancestor, and then micrantha evolved from the same ancestor. So that's kind of how you read these phylogenetic trees. And what I noticed from studying these phylogenetic trees is that, of course, the more closely related these are, like this, the more common traits they tend to share. And it's usually their floral trait that is the most common or the most similar thing. So when you take into account something like rhombea and ewaldiana, while they do share some, I guess, vegetative traits, like they look pretty freaking different, right? But their flowers really don't. If you go down to, I think, Rhipsalis, you can see the same kind of thing here, where we have different forms of teres that are very closely related. What's interesting is that you see this right here. So Rhipsalis teres form capilliformis. Actually, there was an evolution. There was a common ancestor here where they evolved, they split off, and that ended up evolving into sulcata and then evolving into all of those different forms of teres. So that's kind of interesting. And so Rhipsalis sulcata's closest relative is actually Rhipsalis teres. Then when we look at the subspecies of baccifera, you can see like here, subspecies horrida and erythrocarpa, they actually evolved from the same common ancestor. And then when we go back, those along with Mauritianus evolved from the same ancestor. And then back even further, we can see that subspecies baccifera, they all evolved from the same common ancestor. And then we have to go back even further than that to actually see how Rhipsalis heliobiana evolved. But Rhipsalis heliobiana and then all of these species here evolved from the same common ancestor pretty far back. So Rhipsalis heliobiana is not quite as closely related to any of these baccifera, which is why it would have been moved into its own species status. It was once recognized as a subspecies of baccifera. And so there you also see the same thing with Rhipsalis schaefferi. When we go through all of these, you'll see sort of the similarities and the similar traits in their flowers. And then we see the subgenus Rhipsalis. And again, here, I fudged this a little bit because Rhipsalis phylogenetic wasn't in anything, but I do remember reading that its closest relative was pacheco-leonis, subspecies pacheco-leonis. But, you know, the same thing, all 5 of these are pretty closely related. So I think that we just keep that in mind and understand about their flowers when we see them, how similar they are. And then this was news to me that this subgenus was instated or reinstated, the epilogonium, and it looks like Rhipsalis paradoxa was put in there, both subspecies, and they, of course, are most closely related to each other. And then we see the subgenus Rhipsalis. And what's in here is really all of the Rhipsalis that have these kind of campanulate flowers. So these flowers that are like this, the ovary being there and these being the petals. So all kind of bell-shaped. We see that, I thought this was kind of interesting, that Rhipsalis pilocarpa and Rhipsalis campoportoana were each other's closest relatives. And then I fudged this here because Rhipsalis aurea wasn't in there. I think in the real thing that I looked at, Rhipsalis pulchra and Rhipsalis burchellii were each other's closest relatives, and you could definitely see that in their flower ovary. I'm not really sure where Rhipsalis aurea is placed. I think I just read a paper that said that Rhipsalis aurea's closest relative was pulchra. And then we see that Rhipsalis serioscula is kind of on the outside there, meaning it's not really as closely related to these as they are to each other. And then again, we see Rhipsalis jungeri, the same thing. And then again, we see that Rhipsalis clavata, the forms are most closely related to each other, and that's no surprise. And of course, their closest ancestor is quite a ways back, so Rhipsalis clavata is not really quite as related to any of these But what's interesting to me about this is that this evolution down this way versus here, the forms of Rhipsalis clavata don't really form those long basal branches. It's super, super rare, I guess, that they do that. And what I mean by the long basal branches is, of course, you would have your Rhipsalis here, and you would have these guys like maybe growing like this, and they have all those little branches, and they just keep splitting off. And then sometimes you see them get finished drying my pot. And then sometimes you see them go like this and form a big long basal branch like that, and maybe form some little branchlets off at the end. Rhipsalis clavata just doesn't really do that. But all of these other ones do to varying degrees. So I thought that was really interesting. And then we get to Calamo rhipsalis, which is my favorite. And all of these species here have these erumpent flower buds. And because of the split, Rhipsalis paradoxa, both subspecies also have those erumpent flower buds. And I would also say that Rhipsalis pittieri does to some small degree as well. But here you can see this is a little bit crazy and kind of a mess. So I think that what we're going to end up seeing happening at some point is that Rhipsalis dismilis form dismilis and Rhipsalis dismilis form epiphyllanthoides are likely to be separated at some point, and given their own distinct species status. It's interesting, all of these right here being very closely related to each other, they all have very similar flowers. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then Rhipsalis dismilis form epiphyllanthoides, Phlocosa subspecies Oreophila, and then what was Phlocosa subspecies tucumenensis, but looks to have been given its own species status, are each other's closest relatives. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. And so that is actually the reason why tucumenensis was given its own species status. I wouldn't be surprised if Oreophila follows suit pretty soon. We see that Rhipsalis puniciodiscus and Hollerii and Nevis armandii all share this common ancestor, and I thought this was interesting because recently I found out that Rhipsalis puniciodiscus can have yellow stamen, or it can have those kind of reddish stamen, which is super fascinating because Nevis armandii shares that same genetic trait, which it kind of blew my mind when I found that out. And then you see Rhipsalis hollerii, as well. They share this common ancestor between Nevis armandii, but had a split and evolved differently. And do you want to call out here that I also think that at some point pacheco-leonis subspecies catenulata and pacheco-leonis subspecies pacheco-leonis are likely to be moved to their own species. I don't think that there's any reason to get upset or angry about things being reclassified at all, because all that is really happening is that we are gaining more and more knowledge, and that is kind of the nature of science. The way that I've presented these slides is I've actually presented them more in their phylogenetic order than any other kind of order. And the reason why I've done that is so that we can really understand the similarities between them when they're very closely related. And you can see, we didn't really look at it, but you can see when we have these shifts between their subgenre, because that's where they have rather large changes in their appearances. These all evolved from the same common ancestor. These all evolved from the same common ancestor. So that would be why that would be the case. And it was fairly far back. We're going to take a quick moment to talk about something that's kind of important, which is called phenotypic plasticity. So this sounds really complicated, but essentially, if we just read a little bit of what is on this evolution.berkeley.edu site, for example, if you take a mustard plant seedling and move it to an environment with high carbon dioxide levels, the new leaves grown in that environment will have fewer stomata. Is this change in stomata an example of evolution at work? Clearly, the answer is no. In this situation, there is no change in the genetic makeup of the plant or its population, which could be passed on to the next generation. This non-heritable change in the mustard seedling is called phenotypic plasticity, meaning that the organism's phenotype is flexible and can be influenced by the environment. We are familiar with phenotypic plasticity from human populations. The average human alive today is taller than the average human alive 100 years ago, but this change is not the result of evolution. Instead, it's probably mainly the result of diet. Human diet is on average better today than it was 100 years ago, causing humans to grow taller. So the reason why we're pausing and taking a look at this is the notion of this is really important. When we're actually talking about evolution, we're talking about something that is passed on. So if you were to take like a Rhipsalis seed and you were to grow that seed, you would see characteristics that were passed on genetically, meaning evolution. But if you were to take that Rhipsalis and you were to say, grow it into different environments and it took on different characteristics in those environments, that's not evolution. That is this phenotypic plasticity, just meaning that morphologically there can be some differences there. And the most common thing that I can think of is just growing a plant in low light versus high light. You will definitely see some morphological changes there. The reason why this is so important is we will kind of get into it when we go through the slides. You will see lots and lots of variation in the same species of Rhipsalis morphologically, which I think just confuses people. I think that people quite often fall into a place of thinking that they have all these different species because there are some of these morphological differences, when it is really just kind of boiling down to these plants potentially being grown in different environments for a long enough period that they kind of maintain those changes, but it's actually not really part of their genetic makeup, as in they would pass it on to their offspring. So this is something that we kind of made for the community. And essentially all we really did here was take pictures of all of the different Rhipsalis flowers and put them in a specific order that was representative of the phylogenetic order that they might be placed in, so the amount of relationships. But there are a couple of small things that I want to call out. When we look at Rhipsalis micranthiform micrantha, I just want to point out the fact that here you can have these kind of pink flowers, and here you can have kind of like these white or yellow flowers. Very important things that I want to point out about this is you can see some minor morphological differences. This comes down to that phenotypic plasticity type thing. You can see that overall the general shape of the flowers appear to be very similar. You can see the stamen placement, the amount of stamen, the stigma, pretty much everything else is just really, really similar. And you see this type of thing quite a bit in Rhipsalis, which makes some of the old descriptions less than helpful because you're expecting a white flower when you might end up with like a pink flower, and that seems surprising. So just in general, when we're talking about like the taxonomy here, you would have to take into consideration more like the general shape, the flowering parts, the ovary, those types of things, a little bit more than, maybe a little bit of an off color. And here you see that exact same thing happening with Rhipsalis form kirbergii. So, here you can see these two flowers. They look disturbingly similar. If you were to actually color them in the same way, they would probably look really close to identical. And so that's what you're looking for. That's what makes these the same species. It's that. And here, if we go down the way, you can actually see the similarities, like how similar the flowers kind of are, and then how they're just kind of shifting a little bit, changing a little bit. When you make those jumps, the big jumps in the subgenus from one subgenus to the next, you'll see a much bigger jump. So in just the overall flower appearance. There are some that are missing just because we don't have the flowers for those just yet, which is fine. Here we see some really interesting things like Rhipsalis triangularis, cereoides, agudoensis, pachyptera, grandiflora. You can see that these flowers actually look really kind of similar, and you notice a big difference here. They have more petals. The general shape of them is a little bit different. Their ovaries are generally a little bit different. So this is the kind of interesting thing about their relationships. Here you can see paradoxa, And then when we look at Paradoxus subspecies septentrionalis, you can see that the flowers are actually quite similar. One just kind of looks a little bit smaller. The petals are a little bit shorter. You know, here too, when we're looking at subspecies of baccifera, you can see that there are these changes in the flowers, but they're still recognizable. They still look very similar. Those are the kinds of things that you are definitely looking for when it comes to taxonomy here. Rhipsalis teres, again, you can see lots of different sizes of Rhipsalis teres flowers, but overall the general appearance of them is very similar. You can see too some interesting things, like when you look back at the subspecies of baccifera, you can see a very small amount of stamen, versus when we look at some of the teres, we generally see more stamen. There's small details like that that can help you to make identifications in the flowers if you're looking at them more in terms of relationships and similarities. Here we see Lindberghiana, and then we see Flagelliformis, Pentiptera, pacheco-leonis, and you can see how all of those flowers, again, that form that one subgenus, they have very, very similar flowering structures, i.e. they all evolved from one specific species down. And so, again, this is just really cool in how this can help you out. It looks like I placed pittieri in a weird space here, just on an island by itself, but that's okay. And so now we get into looking at Pulchra, Campos potoana, Burchellii, Aurea, Cereoides, Jungari, and the clavatas. You can see again, they all flower from the ends, from the tips of the branch segments. They all have these kind of bell-shaped flowers. Granted, they're different colors, but I'm sure you can kind of make out the similarities there. And then we get into the Calamo-Rhipsalis, which has always been, I think, just one of the most fascinating subgenus to me. And here you can kind of see they generally all have these big flowers. You can see that they all kind of have similarities. One thing that I want to point out that's really, really interesting to me here is actually this. I did not know this, but I thought it was really fascinating. I learned this. Rhipsalis puniciodiscus can have both yellow stamen and these kind of like reddish orange stamen, which is really interesting because it's very closely related to Rhipsalis nevis armandii, which also the flowers can have yellow stamen or these kind of orangish stamen. I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. Later on, when I was researching, I did find an article by Nigel Taylor that had this description describing Rhipsalis puniciodiscus as also possibly having these yellow stamen. I just give a shout out to all of the people who kind of helped with these pictures. Not all of these pictures of these flowers are mine. Some of the community members helped. And I also took some of them from the field guide for Rio de Janeiro. I supplemented some of the things that I didn't have with this publication, which is the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Cactaceae of Rio de Janeiro. You can see that this work is dedicated to the public domain. So I did take some pictures from here just to kind of supplement so we can make sure that we actually get it right. Any of those pictures are marked with this green asterisk, and this came from fieldguides.fieldmuseum.org. And now we have Rhipsalis elliptica. Rhipsalis elliptica can be incredibly confusing because there is an extreme amount of variability morphologically for this particular species. The clade sides can be all over the place. The shapes can be all over the place. I've seen plants in the wild that you would look at and be like, there's no way that's Rhipsalis elliptica, but it is, and it always kind of boils down to, again, the same thing. It's the flower. So here we can see these flowers. They typically have about 5 petals, sometimes 6. They can have a little bit more than that too, I think, but they generally have a large amount of stamen. They can get really crazy with their stamen. They can do like this kind of crazy thing with their stamen. Now, I've seen plants that are like this, labeled as Rhipsalis pachyptera quite often, but it would be my opinion based off of the botanical descriptions and everything that it is Rhipsalis elliptica. And was just an unfortunate, like long running mislabeling of those plants. One of the things that I think is really, really confusing to most people is that they expect Rhipsalis elliptica to have very small clades when it in fact can produce huge clades. So again, it just, the clade sizes on these, the shapes and everything can be so variable. Like this one specific plant that's in my collection, you can see it's got like some skinny, longer clades. Then it's got some great big, huge clades. The clades are so many different colors. There's so many different shapes. It's just kind of all over the place. Flower-wise, it tends to actually only produce one or a few flowers per areole, which is more distinct about this than some of the other species that it could be confused with. You can see here there's only one flower bud for all these areoles. I have seen it produce like 2 or 3, but it more commonly has less flowers per areole than some other species. That is the most typical clade shape that I see on it. But again, I've seen some in the wild that they're just all over the place. So this plant is actually the same one that is pictured over here. And there are parts of this plant that are almost black. It is just one that happens to be producing a lot of betulins. And so you can see in the same way the berry on this plant, you can see the overall berry shape, which is kind of important. And you see that it is just kind of this real strong magenta, almost hot pink color. And again, that is from it having just a ton of these betulins. You can have plants of Rhipsalis elliptica that are totally green, and if you put them in the sunlight, they will stay green. And you can have some plants that if you put them in the sunlight will flush red again because of these betulins. And again, that all goes down to that same phenotypic plasticity. Again, clade shapes, clade size, all that kind of stuff here, which can make identifying this one based off of anything but its flowers kind of confusing. Although there are some that, again, like here, they have this very particular kind of growth pattern, very particular kind of clade shape. Ones like this are very easy to identify. There are other ones that are a little less easy to identify. And here we see some of the berries that are off of the plants that have flowers that are more like this. But again, these guys have these long ovaries, same thing as the plants that are over here. They tend to have these very long ovaries, which results in these berries that are kind of elongated like this. And when we get into some of the other ones, some of that will make sense. When this one was described, it was actually described as having these areoles that were very close to the edge of the clades. And so the way that it was described, these areoles being very close to the edge of the clade like this versus the areoles being like more down into the clade like that. It was just described that way. So it's just kind of an FYI. When we look at Rhipsalis micrantha, forma micrantha, we see that the ovary is not really quite as long on these flowers. This plant tends to have 2 to 3 angled branch segments. So here you can see one in my collection where it has almost entirely 2 angles. So all of these are flat. And then we have this one here, which tends to have 2 or 3 angles on the plant. But the flowers generally look identical between the 2 different plants. And there's a bud. You can see the buds have a strong similarity again. And here you know, generally my hand is in the picture just to kind of get a size reference of how big are these things. Rhipsalis micrantha forma kirbergii. So I don't have the pinkish flowers in here, but a couple of things that are obviously pretty important about this guy is this plant can have the branch segments on this plant will be 3+ angled. So they could be 3 angled, 4 angled, 5 angled, 6 angled. They can be, I think, all the way up to 7. It can have a lot of variability again because plants with this species with forms, generally there is just a heavy amount of variability in them. But the one thing that is consistent is going to be, again, the flower. And so you can see it has these kind of white berries. They're a little bit elongated. Here you can see they're green when they're unripe. Here is kind of an interesting one that was in my collection that heavily had more of 3 angles instead of how some of these other ones, like this one, has a lot of angles and actually looks quite a bit like Rhipsalis pentiptera, but it definitely is not Rhipsalis pentiptera. Here you can see the little buds, the little tiny buds that have formed on there. Here, if we look down here, we can see this kind of juvenile growth that the plant sometimes will have, especially just something that happens sometimes whenever the plant is young. Whenever it's first starting out, it's kind of interesting, like it'll produce this kind of, I guess, baby growth, if you want to call it. And sometimes they do that for a little while, particularly from cuttings. And here you can kind of see I put my hand in some of these photos to try to give like a size reference for how big these are. These definitely are not typically as large as the branches of Rhipsalis pentiptera. This can be difficult if you do not have both of these plants for comparison. But here we see these flowers. These are little teeny tiny flowers. These flowers are very, very small. Here you can get a size reference there because my finger's in the shot, so you can see this flower is literally smaller than my fingertip. It is a very tiny little flower. And you can see it kind of has a longer ovary. And now we have Rhipsalis micranthiforma rauiorum. So this one is very similar to Rhipsalis micranthiforma micrantha, but the big difference here is that the clades or the phyloclades are sort of scalloped. So they tend to have this kind of scalloped edging. The clades on this tend to be bigger. They can produce 3 angled branch segments, although typically I see 2, but that doesn't mean that there aren't some out there that maybe have more or less. You know, here we get in again to that phenotypic plasticity, which is basically like the environment kind of changing the form of these plants a little bit. You can see that the plants here, they generally resemble each other, but you can see like this one has a much stronger sort of scalloped edging on it versus this right here, which not quite, versus this one, which seems to have some that are more scalloped and others that aren't. Again, just growing conditions. But the most important thing that you can see here is that is definitely the flower of a Rhipsalis micrantha. So I don't have the best flower pictures for that one, but you can see how big the clades can actually get on this one. They can get fairly sizable, actually. All right, and now if we look at Rhipsalis goebeliana. So this actually goes back to the phylogenetic tree. So we know that Rhipsalis rhombea and Rhipsalis goebeliana are fairly closely related. And what's very interesting is that you can tell. So when we actually look here, I'm going to go to this plant first. So this would be Rhipsalis goebeliana, the very typical one that we just kind of all know and love. And again, you can see this kind of, no, let me change my color so that we can actually see it. All right, so this very typical sort of dentate kind of holly looking pattern that's on a lot of the clades. This would be probably the most recognizable clade shape on this plant, but you see other clade shapes on this plant too. So like down here, you can kind of see these smaller ones at the tips like that. It kind of mirrors how Rhipsalis rhombea is really in a lot of these clade shapes. Here you can see one here. It's kind of hard to see, but it's kind of elongated back here, which is a little bit more like this. Again, it just kind of mirrors some of those variations in the clade shapes. And so again, though, if we were to go look at these flowers, like I actually believe that this flower bud right here is the flower bud off the plant that we were just looking at. The very typical sort of Rhipsalis goebeliana. And so you can see the striking resemblance to the flower buds of Rhipsalis rhombea. One of the very big differences between these two plants, though, is that the ovary part of these flowers, this part, here, it's elongated. It's considerably longer than it is on Rhipsalis rhombea. And when you get down to it, the flowers are also considerably larger than Rhipsalis rhombea flowers. And so here again, we can see all these different flower buds. And what's interesting is that the way that these are actually off of two different plants. And so those flower buds are off of this plant right here and off of this plant right here. And so this plant right here might be surprising because it doesn't really look like the typical Rhipsalis goebeliana. But this is one of those things where the flowers just do not lie here. And so you can see that this is a plant that has carried this particular clade shape that's like this, much heavier than any of the other clade shapes. And that's just something that I've noticed about a lot of the Rhipsalis is they just can tend to do that. Again, the phenotypic plasticity at play here. So these different plants that came from different places. Here we see another flower bud almost ready to open, but you can see how they're just all similar. And even in the comparison photos of these flowers, you can see the same general. They have very close to the same kind of shape, very close to the same kind of stamen count, the stamen arrangement. You can see how long the stigma is on these. Something else about it, it has a very long stigma. That tends to really kind of stick out. This particular one here has a tendency to look a lot like Rhipsalis rhombea, which is interesting because it is actually this plant, and it took a while for this plant to actually start having kind of this form of Rhipsalis goebeliana. It just took a while of it growing out before it really started to do that, but you can see this little clade here at the end, kind of an odd little clade. But the flowers on this one just don't lie because they're too big to be Rhipsalis rhombea. So it is Rhipsalis goebeliana. Here's a really good example where you can see this very long pericarpal. But this particular plant, you'll notice that the ovary of the flower is actually less pinkish. And that, again, it's just down to the phenotypic plasticity, just growing environment. Here you can see one which I think was really interesting. When I initially got this plant labeled as Rhipsalis goebeliana, I thought, no way is that plant Rhipsalis goebeliana. And I was so confused because when it flowered, again, the flower just doesn't lie. There's the flower. The flower is too big. You can see the stamen arrangement, the petals, everything, the stigma. It's definitely Rhipsalis goebeliana. So it was just a very interesting kind of thing to me to see this plant and this one showing these edges, the red edges, in almost the exact same way that Rhipsalis rhombea would. Whereas some of these other plants don't actually do that. So very, very interesting. And then here you can see in the unripe berries, you can see the shapes of these mirroring each other, being almost exactly the same. The only difference is here, and again, this goes down to your betulins. The green unripe berry will end up ripening to white. Meanwhile, this kind of maroonish colored berry like this will end up ripening to that very strong kind of magenta color. So here you can also see the clade size. These clades are kind of, again, they're kind of small. You know, they tend to be bigger than Rhipsalis rhombea, but they're also kind of small clade Rhipsalis. So hopefully that kind of helps with that a little bit. I know that some of these, it's kind of scary because there's so much variability morphologically, but that's one of the things where it really helps in understanding Rhipsalis identification, that it really, really comes down to a lot of the flower more than it does sort of these clade shapes and stuff. They are consistent, but at the same time, some of that can get kind of squirrely. So even here on this particular one, you can see that this, that clade has a very kind of odd shape, and it seems much different than some of the others. But You can also see this plant just in general doesn't seem to have quite as much of these sort of dentate clades like the very typical one down here in the corner. Here when we look at Rhipsalis rhombea, this one is very, very subject to, I think, the whole morphological changes based off of environment. So first and foremost, we want to look at this plant over here on the right. This plant has been floating around in the United States for some time. It's been sold as multiple different things, but it is Rhipsalis rhombea. And one of the things that I want to point out about this plant is that it's actually a little bit monstrous, meaning it's slightly deformed. When you look at these clades, like this clade right here, you can see this kind of weird bunching right at the midrib of this clade. And what that's done to this plant is actually caused kind of a strange thing where it's pulled sort of all of the areoles in and made the lobing of this plant much more prominent than it would otherwise be. I don't quite know what happened to this particular plant or why it's like that. I just know, from the experience of growing it and seeing it that is the case. But I also know that it is Rhipsalis rhombea because of the flowers. So when we get down in here, you can see these other plants, like this right here would be kind of your classic Rhipsalis rhombea. And I want to point out, again, some of these different clade shapes that we see on these. So here you can see this specific clade. It's kind of shaped. It's got this kind of, I guess, dentate kind of lobing like that. You can see here, like this clade is shaped a little bit more like that. So there's a lot of differences. Some of these are really small clades. Some of them are a little bit bigger. Some of them are long and narrow, like this one. It's more three-angled. There's so many different clade shapes on this specific species. And what's really interesting about this is that some of these plants actually tend to maintain more of one of these types of clade shapes than the others. So sometimes there's morphological differences in that way. Again, this is one of these things that makes identifying these flat clade Rhipsalis difficult. This one, you can see my hand is in here. It has very small clades. The clades on this are not very big. I see this often mislabeled as all kinds of crazy things. Here you can see this is no doubt where the plant got its name from. The fact that it had clades shaped like this, which is a rhombic-like shape. Of course, not all of the clades are like that, but a good chunk of them can be. We have on the left side the plant that is more typical, and then on the right side the one that is kind of monstrous, and you can see the coloration and everything. The red outline that this plant is very commonly described as having in the botanical descriptions. Here, just right to the right, we can see a totally wildly different clade shape floating around in there. We can see some flower buds. Something that I want to point to about the flower buds of Rhipsalis rhombea, they have very tiny ovaries, and actually the flowers are very, very small on rhombea. So like here you can see I'm holding those flowers. They're very small. They tend to have like 6 or 7 petals. Sometimes they can have 5, but typically I saw more of like 6 or 7 petals. Here you can see all these flowers. They have the same general kind of shape, even though some of these are actually on totally different plants. Here you can see one of the flowers has 5 petals, while the other one that's right next to it has 6 petals. These I actually don't even think are on the same plant. Here you can see again. So even though these are on different plants, and even though the morphology of the plants just looks a little bit different, they still have the same flowers, which is the thing that helps to identify all of these as the same species. So here you can see again these flowers. Note the very small ovary of the flower. It's just very short. Here you can see a comparison of these flowers side by side. I will say that the plant that has is a little bit more monstrous on the left side here. The flower does tend to be a little bit smaller. So it has all the same characteristics, all the same shape and everything, but something has caused it to be a little bit smaller. And here you can see one of the berries, and and this is actually on the more monstrous plant. You can see that it's kind of shortened. It's a little bit of a reddish color. And there you can see a berry these are unripe berries on one of the plants that is not actually so monstrous, but you can see that the berries are typically the same shape. One's just a little bit longer than the other one. And then you can see the color of a ripe berry here is actually very, very bright, kind of magenta color. I think these berries are described as red. I don't know, to me, they always look magenta or pink, but to the author, they must have looked red. Here again, we can look at the ovaries, the flowers on both plants. So it seems like whatever happened to the midrib, whatever weird thing caused it to be misshapen or monstrous, it had some kind of an odd effect on the flowers to make them, again, just a little bit smaller. They're almost identical in every other way. Here you can see the clades, again, doing a direct comparison of like one on a more normal plant and then one on this kind of monstrous plant. And you see there are so many similarities between the plants, other than the fact that one of them had much deeper lobing, but the similarity, again, of course, just being the flower. So now we can throw a really big monkey wrench in there, which is the fact that these berries, even though in the botanical descriptions always describe them as being like this red color, it turns out that there are also green clones with white berries. You will find in this presentation that this is a very common thread. All right, so we're actually going to switch, and I'm just going to present this in the thing that I created in, because quite frankly, that whole iBooks thing is not working for this at all. So we will actually see what is a green clone, which would have white berries. And you can see the flowers here. You can see the little tiny ovary. You can see the flower shape is generally very similar. So again, this whole morphology thing, just the plant, depending on how it's grown or where it's grown, the changes that can take place there. And again, I just cannot stress enough why identifying these flat-clade Rhipsalis might be that difficult. Oh, FYI, when I actually show these pictures, like that particular picture came out of a legitimate botanical journal by the actual botanists, so it's not like something that I'm just pulling off of the internet out of nowhere. And then if we look at Rhipsalis ewaldiana, the general morphology of the plant is certainly unique. And I think it was a really big surprise when they did the phylogenetic studies and they found that this was so closely related to Rhipsalis rhombea. And it was probably kind of confusing for a lot of botanists when that kind of came out. But if we take a look at these flowers, they look very, very similar to the flowers on Rhipsalis goebeliana. And again, with those phylogenetic trees, these two plants would have actually evolved from the same plant. So it's not surprising that they share these kinds of characteristics. Now, again, you can see the flower buds also, striking resemblance. You can see they have kind of that long ovary. And here you can see from the side, again, very, very similar. You can see the stigma kind of pops out. It's kind of long. Again, very, very similar. And what's interesting is that the berries, so these unripe berries, they also have a lot of similarities in the shape, the just general shape. Here you can see there's a green one there on a more green plant. And then if we look, oh, there's another green plant, and we can see a little unripe berry in the general shape. And then if we go, I know that there's a red one in here somewhere. Where is the red one? I don't know where the red one is. Oh, it was right in front of me, right in the middle. So, here you can see these sort of reddish colored unripe berries, again, mirroring Rhipsalis goebeliana's appearance. And so what happens is that these berries ripen. The green ones will ripen to white. The sort of maroon ones will ripen to this kind of pinkish or magenta-ish color. Again, the exact same thing that you see. And so mirroring too in these plants, some of the plants, they have a more stout appearance, but they all have this kind of dimorphic morphology where they present two different types of branches here. So with ewaldiana, you get these long branches like this, and then you get all of these little branchlets that come off of there. So that is what dimorphic means. It just literally has two different types of growth consistent on the same plant. And so you see this kind of everywhere. You see it on all of them. Some grown in different conditions. It can just be a little bit different. There's a flower that is actually a little bit of a different color. It's a little bit gold, still bears the same shape. What's interesting is this kind of a reddishness that is there at the bottom of the stamen or at the bottom of the stigma is something that all three of the species that we just looked at can do. It's a trait that they can all share. So Rhipsalis rhombea, Rhipsalis goebeliana, and Rhipsalis ewaldiana, all three of them can present that sometimes. Not always, just sometimes. But these were just all different plants that I picked up from all different places. And this one right here is the one where the botanical description would have come from. It's more of the type plant. So where the original botanical description came from, and it's the one that they found, I believe, in cultivation. Not that long ago, it was actually that they found some of them growing in the wild in a park, and that was how it was finally confirmed that it could also have white berries. But you can see all the little pink berries. It is one where you can see that the branch segments are thinner. They're not quite as thick as some of the other green ones that we've looked at, and they also have a kind of a reddish flesh to them, and the edges can also get reddish. Don't think I have one that really looks like that, but you can see it a little bit like here, a little bit of a reddish edging to those clades. Again, mirroring the same thing that we saw was a common characteristic between Rhipsalis goebeliana, Rhipsalis rhombea, and Rhipsalis ewaldiana. So they all kind of shared those characteristics. Again, because they are all very closely related. And so it's the help that phylogenetics can provide in terms of being able to identify them just yourself. I know that all of that seems a little bit complicated, but I think it just boils down to, again, the confusion that a lot of people have in assuming that these would have to be different species like these two plants right here. A lot of people would try to think that those are two different species because they present differently morphologically, just when you look at them, but the flowers just do not lie. And so they aren't two different species. They are both just Rhipsalis ewaldiana, and what we're looking at is that phenotypic plasticity. And then we get to Rhipsalis cuneata, subspecies cuneata, which again is very, very closely related to Rhipsalis occidentalis. And so here you see a flurry of different clade shapes. There are so many different things kind of going on here. So you can see here the resemblance in these clade shapes. Generally, these were quite small. Do you remember reading something about this species that in cultivation, the clades would actually end up being smaller than, like, if this plant is in the wild, the clades are quite a bit bigger. So, you know, here you can see kind of the resemblance there even still yet to sort of like your Rhipsalis crispata and these clade shapes. You can see the very, very deep lobing, as this one was reported to have as well, that kind of deep lobing in these clades. You can see the base, they're always wedge-shaped, which is how this species got its name. Here you can see different kinds of clade shapes. These are a lot thicker than the Rhipsalis oblonga. These are quite thick. They're still kind of more delicate, but they're quite thick. There's another clade shape that's on there. Here we see some more clade. So you can see the resemblance here too between, you know, this particular plant and then Rhipsalis occidentalis. And here's another little plant that I have. It's a really, really pretty plant. I will say that it actually really is quite difficult to grow. Just in general, it just really, really seems to need like really strong, good humidity. Otherwise, it just seems to kind of struggle a little bit. You can see some of these clades are really cute. Like when the new growth comes out, they're like kind of frilly at the edges. It's really, really attractive. Here is a different kind of clade shape that's on there. So again, this is one of these things that I think that this does bear a striking resemblance to some other species, which is how I think some things got kind of confused. But you see, there's just so many different clade shapes going on here. And so I actually happened to find a picture of this plant in flower. This has been in the United States for a while, kind of floating around. And so here you can see this plant in flower. You can see it's got these little tiny, tiny flowers. So little tiny flowers. They are not very big. You can tell from this picture, these flowers are very small. You can tell that they have a little teeny tiny round ovary. Little tiny round ovary. And this plant, I found it under the name Rhipsalis oblonga. However, according to the botanical descriptions, this shouldn't be Rhipsalis oblonga because the petals are not long enough for it to have been Rhipsalis oblonga. So I genuinely think the flowers here have a striking resemblance to Rhipsalis occidentalis. And so I genuinely think that these are the flowers of Rhipsalis cuneata. I've seen them in publications too. I do know that these flowers are very tiny. I do know they have a very teeny tiny ovary to the flower. The berries on this are white as well. I wouldn't imagine that this would look, the berries or anything really that much different than Rhipsalis occidentalis. And then we have Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis. Now, what is interesting is that if we go back and we remember this clade shape off of this one, there, you can see that Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis, the clade shapes are comprised of more of that kind of thing, and the clades are actually just consistently narrow. One of the things that I found very surprising about this plant, though, is that when I initially got this plant, I imported this from Germany, it did come with the name Rhipsalis cuneata. That these clades were all really small on this plant. You can see they were kind of damaged, and you can even see that they're kind of a reddish color. So it does look like this plant probably has some of those, producing some of those betulins. But they were all really small. And when this plant was outside, it really didn't grow very well. It came inside and still, was just kind of barely growing. And then when I put it in the cabinets, in the Millsbo cabinets, which is like kind of this humidity chamber, really, that's when it really, really started growing. And it happened to produce this kind of ginormously long clade in comparison to the other ones, and it has continued to do so. And so I thought that was really just kind of interesting. You can see it's grown quite a bit. Like a lot of this is actually cabinet growth. So very much likes humidity, which again, this plant was reported to really like humidity, and it is just reported to have these consistently like much more narrow clades, and these clades are very narrow. Here you can see that is the largest clade that it's produced, and you can see that it is quite narrow in comparison to subspecies cuneata, which has much wider clades. Clades are really small. This is one of those things that I can definitely see because there have been a lot of the information that you see in these botanical texts will talk a lot about confusion taxonomically between things like Rhipsalis cuneata, Rhipsalis oblonga, and Rhipsalis goebeliana. And now I think having collected so many of the plants and really looked at them, I can kind of see a lot of that because like this clade actually looks like a clade that might come off of a Rhipsalis goebeliana. And so while some of these clades, like this clade, looks like a clade that might actually come off of Rhipsalis oblonga. So it's totally understandable. And, Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis, not one that is seen very often. Again, same thing as cuneata. I do not think this plant does very well in cultivation. It would have flowers that are very, very similar to Rhipsalis cuneata, which we have seen when we have looked at all of the other subspecies. So we know that subspecies australis's flowers should be very, very, very similar to Rhipsalis cuneata, subspecies cuneata's flowers. So we don't really have to guess there, although I cannot find publicly available pictures anywhere of it. I do know what they look like, so I do know they look very, very similar. I will say that. And Rhipsalis occidentalis. So this is kind of confusing because it is unclear as to whether Rhipsalis occidentalis has been reduced to Rhipsalis cuneata, but from caryophyllolese.org, Rhipsalis occidentalis is still listed as its own species. The thing that I will say about this is, and I've put a couple of pictures in here of what I know to be Rhipsalis occidentalis, although I will say that I think that there are some people who might argue with that. But the person, I didn't know this before, but the person whose Flickr account this is Wilhelm Barthlottii, who was a botanist. And so here you can see these flowers are extremely small. They're very, very small. There is this characteristic of the stamen sort of clustering in a circle there. You can see around the stigma, and then you can see the other stamen kind of curve inwards towards that. That was actually something that was described. You can see the very short ovary. Again, really important. This species has a short flower ovary. Like in comparison to something like Rhipsalis goebeliana, which has a very long ovary to its flower. These are very short. The flower petals are actually kind of a transparent. And here's another picture. And you can see these flowers are very, very, very tiny. Here you can see the general clade shape. These general clade shapes. And here you can see again these general clade shapes. You see the white, more, I guess you would say more circular type berries. There's this one right here, which is a little bit of a teardrop kind of shape or an egg shape, but gives you an overall idea of what Rhipsalis occidentalis kind of looks like. I will say Rhipsalis occidentalis was reported as being very difficult in cultivation, which might be why this plant is not very commonly seen in cultivation. And then if we look at Rhipsalis oblonga, now caveat here is that of all of the research that I have done about this, about Rhipsalis oblonga is probably the most confused plant taxonomically. It's very, very confused. I've looked at many different botanical publications. I've looked at many pictures. I've looked at many sketches. I've looked all over the place, and there is literally only one person that I think I would trust to say that Rhipsalis oblonga is what Rhipsalis oblonga actually is at this point. And there is a link in here, but we aren't going to visit that link just because it goes to a private Facebook group. This document will actually be linked as a PDF, and so you'll be able to go to that link and, see whatever's going on in that Facebook group. But the only thing that I'm going to say about this is that Rhipsalis oblonga is very closely related to Rhipsalis barthlottii. And what the two plants share in common very strongly is generally their flowers. So the general flower shape, the small round ovaries, and the very long petals, that is a characteristic of Rhipsalis oblonga. Rhipsalis oblonga also has round berries when they're ripe, and they are white. And Rhipsalis oblonga's flowers are typically pale yellow, but what you really want to look for when you're looking at for confirmation that a plant is Rhipsalis oblonga is those long petals. It should have a pale yellow flower with a short ovary and long petals. So hopefully that kind of helps with that. But it is my best estimation that this particular plant is Rhipsalis oblonga just from all of the research that I've done. And you can see when we look at this, you know, kind of a similarity. It's getting a little bit less similar, but you can still see sort of the similarity there. I will say that this particular plant has extremely thin clades. You can see how beautiful and wavy, but these are very, very thin. They are the thinnest clades of any Rhipsalis in my whole entire collection. They are kind of paper thin. One of my absolute most favorite plants. I just think it is absolutely gorgeous. I love those wavy edges, everything about it. I can't wait for it to bloom. It hasn't bloomed, but I can't wait for it to bloom so that I can potentially just be like, yes, finally, Rhipsalis oblonga. So we'll have to just wait for a little bit. And then we get Rhipsalis barthlottii, which again is very closely related to Rhipsalis crispata. This one particularly, you can see, like if we take a look at this clade, it looks very, very similar to a Rhipsalis crispata clade. Like it looks quite similar, kind of twisted. These clades are a little bit more succulent, but I would also say that they're kind of more delicate. It's not really as thick as, at least on my plant so far, as the Rhipsalis crispata clades. You can see here a strong similarity in the flowers, although the one very big difference with the flowers was that Rhipsalis barthlottii's flowers are very, very bright yellow. And there are some other things that we are obviously going to be able to see here, but so we see that they're very bright yellow. And one thing that I will point out here is that the ovary, it is very short, but it is also considerably more round. So it doesn't really have that ever so slightly square shape to it. The thing that I will say is very different between the two is actually the length of the petals. Rhipsalis barthlottii's petals are quite a bit longer. One of my favorite things about this plant is actually that it produces these like little red, I don't even know what you call them, glochids, spines, out of the areoles. I just think it's really pretty. Here again, you can see strong resemblance. You can see with like this deep lobing here on this clade to Rhipsalis crispata. One thing that you see is very different here is the ovary shape of the berry. And so these berries, they actually ripen to be a sort of pinkish reddish kind of color. Again, open to interpretation because some people call this red. I call this pink or magenta. And so I guess I might call this one red, but that's a general idea of what that looks like, really. I think that there's another picture here from this particular person of Rhipsalis barthlottii, and you can see that these flowers are an even deeper yellow. Mine flowered indoors for the first time, so I'm not surprised that it's a little bit paler, a paler yellow, but it's still a very bright yellow. Here again, you can see those gorgeous ovaries. You can see the stamen are generally pretty long. It's a very, very attractive plant. One thing that I will say that I read in a paper a little while ago is some confusion, I think, as to whether or not Rhipsalis barthlottii is actually Rhipsalis crispamarginata. So I think that currently what is accepted is Rhipsalis barthlottii. I don't know if that will ever be worked out, but I just thought that I would throw that out there, that there was kind of a question about that. It's a really, really attractive, beautiful, beautiful plant. You can obviously see here with just my little baby plant and those clades, it's absolutely gorgeous. Really, really stunning. So here we have Rhipsalis crispata. This is one that I think is kind of complicated. It took a while for me to track this one down because I think that there was a lot of taxonomic confusion, and even their descriptions, it seemed like there was just a lot of confusion there. But going through a lot of different botanical journals, looking at a lot of different pictures, reading a lot of different descriptions, I basically settled on that Rhipsalis crispata was pointing specifically at this plant. Different types of characteristics here. I think this is actually one of the most easy Rhipsalis to identify. Obviously, it has these clades. They're very shiny. They're green. Typically, they can be kind of a yellowish green, at least the ones that I've seen. I will point out that this has a tendency to be very, very strongly lobed. The clades is something that was called out in the botanical descriptions. Sometimes you get some that are elongated like this one. The clades can be, you can see here, quite large, quite small. You can see sometimes there's a little bit of like ruffling at the edges. It's kind of contorted. And if we look at these flowers here, I had 2 different clones of this, or 2 different plants. One of them was a deep green like this, and then the other one was kind of a lighter color, kind of a yellowish green. And here you can see the new growth on both of them. You can see it mirrors each other. They look pretty much identical, just a different color. And here you can see the flowers on the green one. These also have a very kind of squat ovary. The ovary is a little tiny bit squarish, I would say. The flowers are kind of a medium size for Rhipsalis flowers. And then on this side, so here we see the color of that one is kind of a dirty yellow, I guess you would say. Then we see over here, these flowers, they're the same shape. They have the same general stamen arrangement, the same general kind of stigma shape, the same general kind of ovary shape. They are a little bit of a different color, and the lighter colored one actually came off the lighter colored plant. Here you can see the comparison of the 2 different flower buds. They look pretty much identical, although this one was a little bit further along in its development. And here you can see the lighter colored one in full flower there. So this one had a tendency to have anywhere from 1 flower up to quite a few. I think I saw like 4. So it could have multiple flowers per areole. Now what's interesting is that you see this flower right here is very, very yellow in comparison to the other ones that we've looked at. However, that flower is actually the same plant as this one. So just under different conditions, this was flowering indoors through the winter time. This was flowering outdoors in the summertime. Just created a little bit of a different color. I do really like the new growth on these particular plants. I just think it's really pretty. And here again, we can kind of see a side view of the one that was flowering indoor. And there again, we can see the ovary. If we go over here to the unripe berries, you can see what I mean with these ovaries. They're short, squat, and maybe a little bit angular, a little bit squarish looking, I guess you would say. And there is one on one of the others, again, a little bit squarish looking. And here's a berry that is either ripe or almost ripe, and it's kind of a greeny white color. And then sometimes the berries actually end up like this, where it's a little bit more of like an egg kind of shape. But again, kind of a greeny white color. Here again, kind of a greeny white color. So this one, in my opinion, is just really highly identifiable just in general. You know, the branch segments, they're kind of thick. They do have the midrib on these. Like here you can see this midrib in the clades. It's very, very, very prominent. All these things were generally called out in the botanical descriptions. And Rhipsalis olivifera, not one that you see in collections very often. It's just really not that common. I don't know if it's that we don't see it or that it doesn't flower. So I have a plant that I'm fairly sure is Rhipsalis olivifera. It's my oldest Rhipsalis. It's never flowered. So that might be the weirdness of what's going on here. There is, again, a link in here to a Facebook group that has the most gorgeous picture I have ever seen of Rhipsalis olivifera. I've probably looked at that picture no less than 30 times. But Again, because it's a private group, I'll just put the link there. And if you want to join the group and see that picture, go ahead. Otherwise, we do have these from the field guides, which you can see the absolutely adorable pink flower. And here you see how it got its name, which is the green olive-like berries. I think that that's a ripe berry. So I don't think that that's unripe. I think that is a ripe berry on this. And so here I did happen to find some pictures from one of my favorite websites, actually. So this is cactus-epiphytes.eu. And here you can see the plant. This has quite large clades. So it is reported to have clades that are very large, very similar to like Rhipsalis pachyptera. That's what most of the descriptions say. You can see that these clades are quite large. I think that the jointing here that you can see where the clades meet is really interesting. It seems very thick and kind of woody to me. Here you can see these flower buds. You can see the ovary is kind of a short ovary. You can see a lot of this sort of like reddish pinkish tinge on these flower buds. I will say that Rhipsalis olivifera was not actually only reported to have pink flowers. It can also have yellow flowers. So while these are pinkish, sometimes the flowers are actually more pink than even this, and sometimes they are actually more yellow than this. And you can see this person measured the flower here, and he actually said that it had a diameter of 20 millimeters, which I think is like 2 centimeters. So it's not the smallest flower. And phylogenetically, again, we can kind of say that this is on an island just kind of by itself. So it's not that surprising to me that it seems a little bit different than a lot of the other ones that we've looked at. Like, it would be hard to point and say this looks most related to that. I think when I read this person's blog, they did actually say this plant took a very long time to flower. So here again, absolutely gorgeous. Really, I really, really love that, especially because you just never see any pictures of the flowers. Here, if we look at Rhipsalis russellii. So the thing that I'm going to say about Rhipsalis russellii is that my plant of this, I actually thought was Rhipsalis pachyptera for a very, very long time. I think it was only when I realized the fact that I had had that plant for so many years and it never flowered. And then I started really doing research for this presentation that I realized that, oh snap, that plant that I thought was always Rhipsalis pachyptera is actually Rhipsalis russellii. So I have 2 different plants of this, but this is something that I think is really interesting and going back to just morphological variations and why I think that a lot of times when someone's looking for an identification of a Rhipsalis and they just have pictures of these flat clade types, these are the ones that I'm going to have a hard time wanting to identify. And this is part of the reason why. So that clade, this gigantic clade, this smaller clade, and this teeny tiny clade all came off of this one plant. So this one plant that I have growing in multiple different varying conditions has produced all these wildly different clades. And so that's one of the really big issues. Again, going back to that phenotypic plasticity, just being in different conditions, the amount of variability just on the one single plant. And now we see this guy right here, which has very tiny clades right now and really doesn't even look like the same species, but it is the same species. And that is only really going to become apparent over the flower. And so here I have a couple of links because this is one of the ones that is extremely easy to identify when it flowers. So here we see pictures of berries, and you can see it has massive clusters of these like really gorgeous sort of pinkish berries. I've seen these berries be in multiple different shades, lighter pink, darker pink. It just depends on, again, how the plant was grown, the kind of conditions it was grown in. But you can see just clusters and clusters and clusters of berries. And here we see these flowers. Okay, so the thing that I'm going to say here is these are the tiniest little teeny flowers. These are so small. They are just uber tiny. And you can see the clusters of them that come out of these areoles. So they come out, these little teeny tiny flowers in these clusters at the areoles. And so this is extremely easy to identify once it has flowered. And all you need for this one is the flowers, these little teeny tiny white little star-shaped flowers. It's really all you need. And so that's just one of the problems with the whole identification based off of clades. Like I said, I would have said hands down that particular plant, that this plant was actually Rhipsalis pachyptera. And it took me a very long time to realize that it was not. Because even this clade right here, this great big ginormous clade that it produced, it looks like a Rhipsalis pachyptera clade to me. So that's just an FYI. And what's interesting is that part of the reason why that is probably the case is because Rhipsalis russellii and Rhipsalis pachyptera are fairly closely related. One last thing that I want to say about this one is that I do just want to point out the kind of spacing at the areoles here. This kind of deep, kind of squarish kind of spacing. That's just something that I want to point out about this, is that it does tend to have that kind of deep, squarish spacing at the areoles. So even here, you can see on these where they're tiny little clades, you can see that. But just tons of morphological variation here. And Rhipsalis agudoensis. In the United States, this plant has gone under, it's had so darn much confusion, but this is Rhipsalis agudoensis. I've looked at just so many different botanical publications. This is actually legit Rhipsalis agudoensis. This one I imported from Germany. You can see that the clades are typically 3-angled. Sometimes they're 2-angled. They're not super small clades. They're not at all small. They're quite large, actually. And here you see my plant, and you can see that as it's grown up, it's produced some 2-sided clades. The clades here have gotten a little bit longer. Here you can see, generally when I very first got them, you can actually see some of these have kind of a red flush to them. So it does look like the plant, at least some of these are capable of producing these betulins. You can actually see some corking here at the joints. That's just like scarring, like old tissue. Sometimes they just get woody. Here you can see some clades growing. It's a pretty attractive plant. And here we can see from the field guides, the flowers. So it's got these small flowers, again, this one being pretty closely related to Rhipsalis russellii, and you can kind of see that with the clusters of the flowers at the areoles, the short ovaries. You can see here these clusters of flowers. I don't think these flowers are as small. And here you can see some berries there. They seem to be kind of short and squat. And you can see that kind of pinkish, magenta-ish berry. I don't think these berries are always pinkish magenta-ish, but I think that one happened to have pinkish magenta-ish berries. Here's some other flower pictures that it looks like I found. Very attractive. Very, very attractive, very cute. There's really not much else to say about that one, I don't think. And here we see again, this is something that's coming from a botanical article, not something that's just off the internet somewhere. But it is really fascinating to see the resemblance because of the genetic relationships. I do think that's quite fascinating. And Rhipsalis cereoides, not a plant that would be easy to confuse with anything else, really. At least I don't think so. So this is a plant that I believe can actually also, a species that can also grow terrestrially, which means like just actually in the soil. And so you can see these are typically 3-angled. Sometimes they're 4-angled. It's just not one that I think is easy to mistake for anything else. It's really not. The clades, they seem to be, they can be quite small. They can also be quite large. I've seen them both. Like this one right here was quite large, whereas most of the other ones were quite small. So it probably just comes down to growing conditions. Here you can see these guys growing outside. They look like, you can see it was growing terrestrially here. But it growing outside, you can see that the clades seem to, they have the ability to get considerably larger. You know, here you see these, again, we have the short ovaries. You can see the resemblance in the flowers, just the overall resemblance to like agudoensis. And there you see some of the berries. So really cool. Looks like I found a different flower picture here. So really cool. I don't know that many people grow this one. I think it's just kind of a little bit of an oddball Rhipsalis, really. I think it's kind of fun to grow, though. I think they're all fun and interesting to grow, and you know, in their own way. And Rhipsalis triangularis, and here you can see these all came from the field guides for Rio de Janeiro. You can see that these tend to be very, very deeply lobed, and they seem to be considerably more consistently 3-angled in comparison to how like Rhipsalis agudoensis would have like 2 and 3-angled. These just seem to be more consistently 3-angled. And there's the flower. It looks like the flower is probably quite a bit larger. Again, though, we see these short ovaries. We see the clusters of berries, the short ovaries. This one, I believe, is very closely related to Rhipsalis pachyptera. And so, you know, here we see these berries. We see that the berries, they are short, squat, round berries. It's just something to call out in terms of like whenever we go look at Rhipsalis pachyptera, the resemblances here. And then this berry actually looks like it's more of a white berry. And it looks like I found some links. So one of my favorite places is actually this gbif.org to look for occurrences of different species. And so here we actually see Rhipsalis triangularis growing out in the wild. Look at how cool is that? And again, it is growing more terrestrially, I would say. It looks like it's on a rock face in a bunch of decomposing kind of stuff there. Or it looks like a rock, I guess, not necessarily a rock face, but you can see it looks like it's all very quite thick, quite stiff, and generally quite 3-angled. That's not to say that it can't produce a 2-angled clade or even a 4-angled clade. And then here we see it in a botanical publication, and you can see the flowers are quite a bit larger than, say, agudoensis. And now we get to Rhipsalis pachyptera. And so Rhipsalis pachyptera typically has quite large clades, but again, same thing with just like how Rhipsalis russellii growing in different conditions could produce smaller clades. You can see here that this plant, some of the clades are quite large, some of the clades are quite small. Sometimes they get elongated like this, which is the exact same thing that happens with Rhipsalis russellii. So sometimes just growing conditions, you know. Here you can see one of the clades in my hand. It does not look that much different from the clade that was in my hand for Rhipsalis russellii. You can see here it's got these huge sort of like, I don't know, I don't even know what you would call that, but it's like a flat sort of space in between the lobes on the clades. It's really, really interesting, and it seems to be fairly consistent. So even on clades that are shaped a little bit differently, it is still a fairly consistent kind of thing. So even when we go and look at some clades like this one, you will still typically see that it has that kind of squarish indent there. And I kind of zoomed in on that for some of these. So you can see that. You can also see that there's some little hairs in there at the aerial. And here we see the flowers. Typically has less stamen, just in general. You can see that the stamen here, there's really not that many. So these would be two different clones, this one and this one. And you can see that there's some slight differences in the general petal shape of the flowers, more in terms of the length of the petals in the flowers. But overall, you can see that the stigma and the stamen, same general arrangement, same general kind of quantity, same general shape. This particular flower had a very, very, very short ovary. That's something that I've noticed very consistently about this species, is that it tends to have this very short ovary, and it tends to sit very deeply because it has that big space. It tends to sit very deeply into the clade. Here you can see the flowers are quite large, so about 2 centimeters. They're very large flowers, actually. It can produce many, many flowers per aerial. Many, I think it's like all the way up to potentially 9. It can get pretty crazy up in there. You can see again here, it's such a tiny, tiny ovary. And then there, and one of the things that I did notice about mine was just the overall stigma lobes. Quite a few. That one's got about 7. So very attractive. I will say that I didn't find pictures. It was very difficult. But I do want to call out the fact that these flowers were a little bit more yellow. So the flowers on this can be white and they can be more yellow. But that comes with the warning. So the flower shape, just overall, everything about the flower is not going to just drastically change. Because I see a lot of Rhipsalis that look more like Rhipsalis elliptica being called Rhipsalis pachyptera. The shape of those flowers, the quantity of stamen, the stigma lobes, the ovary, everything is quite different. So it would have a yellow flower but still maintain this shape. Rhipsalis pachyptera also tends to have a lot more petals than some of the others, which you can see again because of these genetic relationships. So, you know, when we look at triangularis, you can see that these flowers have a lot more petals. And so here, the same thing, when we look at Rhipsalis pachyptera, there's a lot more petals to the flowers. These typically have, I think, somewhere like 6 to 9 petals or something like that. So like this, you can see has 8 petals. Whereas like some of your other species like Rhipsalis elliptica, those ones that are down there, they tend to have less petals. Less petals, more stamen. Less stigma lobes. So longer ovary. Petals tend to be very, very, very recurved, whereas here they're not quite so much. That's not to say that there couldn't be clones that have more recurved petals, but typically this is the Rhipsalis pachyptera that I know. And here you can see an unripe berry again, just this very, very, very tiny ovary. And so when we looked at Rhipsalis elliptica, you would have noticed that the ovary for the unripe berry was considerably longer than this. And here again, we see that kind of spacing. But again, I genuinely think that without flowers or without some other real clear sign, it would be very difficult to tell the difference between some Rhipsalis pachyptera and some Rhipsalis russellii. So these are the cases where I just will not identify these without flowers, typically. Here you have ripe berries, and so you can see even in the ripe berries They are very like short and squat. And they're typically white, but they are not always white. They can actually be pink. I did not find pictures, but I do want to say that the entire epidermis, so the whole entire like epidermis of the clades, could actually be entirely red. I have seen pictures of Rhipsalis pachyptera that were very obviously Rhipsalis pachyptera. You could see it in their clade shapes. You could see it in their flowers and the little tiny ovaries, where the whole entire plant is completely red and the petals of the flower are yellow. So that is entirely possible. And with that would also come berries that are not necessarily white, but they could be pink. So here we have a picture of, looks like some berries, and what I grabbed here was actually a plate. So this is a plate from Britton and Rose, the Cactaceae Volume 4. And I just want to point out that even then, when they drew these, a lot of times in old botanical sketches, if you look closely enough at the details, you will see the same things. So you can see that same kind of like squarish indent in between the clade lobes. You can see these short, squat, white berries that they've drawn here. They're very round sort of berries, very different than some of your other species. And here we have Rhipsalis grandiflora. Unfortunately, Rhipsalis grandiflora was very, very mislabeled in the United States. It's really strange. I think of all the plants in my collection, I picked up the most Rhipsalis grandiflora under wrong names than any other Rhipsalis. It was really kind of intense. So I happen to have a lot of Rhipsalis grandiflora now. So here's one of my plants. And you can see here too, these have more of a determinate kind of growth. These will only grow so long. So they don't just get like super, super long. Each growing season, they tend to grow kind of a consistent length. You can see there are two different clones here. So there's this one, and then there's this one. And again, same thing that we saw with some of the other plants that we've looked at is that the petals on one of these clones is a little bit shorter, but overall, it's got the same kind of flower shape. It's got the same kind of ovary. The flowers emerge in the same way. The buds look exactly the same. The stigma looks about the same. It's just that the flower petals are shorter. It does look like this one tends to have less flower petals in general, which that doesn't always make it its own species. So I know that's kind of a weird thing because we're like, huh? It's just that sometimes maybe this clone just seems to have lots more energy to produce more petals for some reason. It's also more established in my collection than this one was. But that is actually this plant. I do notice that a lot of these are running around in the United States. This one came under a name of a locale that it was collected in, but it is just a clone of Rhipsalis grandiflora. I see a lot of those. Some interesting things, Rhipsalis grandiflora does tend to kind of get this reddening at the areoles. Is certainly by far not the only species that can do that kind of thing. Quite a few of them can do that kind of thing. Here you can see the new growth coming out of the ends. It is not a rampant new growth. And what I mean, like even when we look at the flower buds here, it's not really erumpant. You can see that right away whenever you look at these flower buds, you can see the ovary. And you can see it will produce just tons and tons of those. You can see sometimes this gets kind of this sort of hairy growth, kind of a juvenile growth. Here you can see new growth coming out again. It's not really erumpant. It doesn't like form loops and start forming underneath, or, you know, the tip gets stuck in the areole the way that like some of your Calamo-Rhipsalis will. Here you can see a berry. These berries range from being white to pink. Sometimes I see them, they're a little bit different sizes, a little bit of a different texture. Here you can see that as these flowers were kind of aging a little bit, they were pink. This is actually the same plant. And so you can see that even just from there to there, for some reason, some of the flowers were more pink and, you know, in a different blooming
Some of the flowers were not. And there you can see the unripe berry, which is kind of this greenish color, but you can see the apex of that is a little bit reddish, which is how, when it ripens, it ends up having that little bit of pink tint of color there. Here you can see, again, those reddish kind of areoles. And a different set of berries here. So you can see, again, the berries look a little tiny bit different, but not enough to be like, that's a different species. Here you can see a different plant. All of these plants have bloomed. I can confirm that every single last one of them is in fact Rhipsalis grandiflora. This right here is one that this type of thing, it has a strong resemblance in photographs. When you just see like the plant itself, it can have a very strong resemblance to like Rhipsalis nevis armandii for megalantha. So that's just kind of an FYI, something to watch out for, is that some clones of Rhipsalis grandiflora can bear striking resemblance. Here we see a better picture of the new growth coming out, and you can see, we'll see later with nevis armandii, it is not erumpent, it just comes out, just starts coming out, doesn't do anything crazy or curious or interesting. It's a truly gorgeous, gorgeous species. Absolutely love this species. Rhipsalis pittieri, pretty easy to identify this guy. Without blooms, maybe a little bit difficult, but generally pretty easy to identify this guy. It has these rather long, it grows really long and pendant like this, but you will notice that these have a determinate length. So you see how these are consistently of some kind of length here, each branch segment. So it doesn't just continuously grow like some of your other species. The flowers are very small. So here you can see that this particular flower was about 1 centimeter. So that's quite a bit smaller than some of the other species that it might have looked like. This was at one time classified as Rhipsalis flacosa, subspecies pittieri. I believe it was also genetic testing that moved this into its own species. You can see how some of the new growth looks. You can see differences sort of in the flowers. Sometimes they have 6 petals, sometimes they have 5 petals. You can see these really weird little green buds poking out there. One of the things that I've noticed is that before it flowers, it kind of does this weird thing where it kind of like breaks through. So it's kind of sort of like underneath the epidermis, the bud forms is a little less though than some of your other flacosa, but you can see here new growth doing kind of a little looping thing. You can see the wool there. You can see it's got white berries, and you can see the, kind of white wool around the berries. Before the berry ripens, when it first comes out, it's this little tiny, tiny green looking thing. It takes a long time for these berries to ripen. And you can see about how thick the branch segments are here. They're fairly beefy. They're not like super thick, but they're fairly beefy. And here we see Rhipsalis sulcata, probably in the United States, one of the most confused plants. So here we see this beautiful sort of yellow flower. You can see in various different stages. I remember this picture. I actually caught that picture as the flower was closing, I think. And it's a very difficult species to catch the flower without the petals being super reflexed like this. So he's really kind of a cutie, striking resemblance to, I think, Rhipsalis teres form heteroclada in a lot of different ways, actually. So you can see about how thick the branch segments are. They're quite thin. They're not super thick at all. You can see the flower buds. You can see the ovaries, short, squat. Again, these are very, very sort of teres looking, heteroclada, form heteroclada looking. And here you can see that the branch segments tend to be 4 or 5 angled. I've noticed that on my plants. On occasion, they can drop down to 3 angled. Depends on if something in their, maybe something in their environment would have caused something like that. Here you can see the new growth coming out. I will say that this species is not dimorphic. So other species like Rhipsalis ewaldiana presenting 2 different, very distinct types of growth. Rhipsalis sulcata is not like that, is not dimorphic. All of its growth is actually pretty much this, what you see here. It is comprised of these long growths that continuously tend to grow out of the ends of the previous branch segment. So you can see that in its new growth here. You can see some new clades coming out there. And then over here, you can see these new clades coming out. They tend to come out towards the ends. And so it just has a very, very long hanging sort of appearance. These are just sort of rooted cuttings. And here with my hand in the shot, you can see just about how long they really are. They're very long, and it is considerably longer than, say, Rhipsalis micranthiform kirbergii, and typically much thinner and much, much, much thinner than like Rhipsalis pentaptera. And again, typically considerably longer branch segments. It's supposed to have white berries. I've never seen the berries, nor have I found any picture of the berries. So now we can look at Rhipsalis teres forma heteroclada. I will say that there's some taxonomic confusion from some of the stuff that I've read and some of the pictures that I've seen, is that it's not terribly clear 100% to me whether this is Rhipsalis teres forma heteroclada or whether this is Rhipsalis teres forma teres. Not entirely sure. We'll go with forma heteroclada here, just with the caveat of knowing that that's a possibility. I think just because some of the botanical texts that I've seen actually show this plant, but when I read the descriptions, it seems like maybe it's supposed to be teres. So just a little bit unclear. But in the phylogenetic testing, it actually showed that the plant that we just looked at, Rhipsalis sulcata, was actually most closely related to Rhipsalis teres. And here you can kind of see that in the flower. So when we looked between this flower and between the flower here, we can see a very strong similarity there. Now, teres, the easiest way to be able to identify this, of course, is that you cannot take anything out of context. So you can't just look at like one specific thing that I'm going to say here and say, well, that's teres. You actually have to take it as a whole. So we're talking about overall plant morphology and appearance here, general flower appearance, and then the fact that for all teres, when the flowers die, the flowers turn a bright yellow. That is a defining characteristic for all teres. I have consistently seen it across all of my plants. The other thing that I have consistently seen is in the flower buds, that the ovary is always considerably shorter than the petal part of the plant throughout almost the entirety of the flower's formation. It doesn't look like I have flower bud here, which I should, but I don't. But we'll see it when I'll point it out when we look at the other forms of teres. So things that I've seen about teres that are kind of interesting here are 2 very distinct types of growth patterns that I've noticed. One is that they tend to throw out these like very long sort of branches. So they'll tend to throw out long branches like, I don't know, this one's kind of long. And then at the ends of those, they will throw out a lot of small little branches like this. It's something that's consistent across all of the teres. And the other thing that I notice is this kind of thing, where they will actually throw out a branch and then they'll just kind of do this kind of strange sort of fanning pattern here. So you can see how it threw these out and it fanned, but then it kind of kept going. And the growth pattern looks, it's hard to explain, but we'll look at it later with some of the other teres. It just looks a little bit different. So, we'll see this and then we'll see that kind of thing, which honestly just looks like it has sort of continued its pattern. But when we see some of the other teres, I think that will become a little bit more clear how it is kind of oddly different. So here you can see lots of new growth. One thing I will say about all of the teres, they love to grow. And here we can see these sort of round little white berries. Those are ripe berries. This plant can have white berries or pink berries, and it can be the whole gamut of spectrum. Like these berries can get extremely, extremely magenta. So that is consistent across all of the teres forms. Here, if we look at what could be teres form heteroclada or form teres, here we can actually see a ton of morphological variation here. It was the same thing with the forms of micrantha. There is so much variation there. It is true also for teres. It seems as though all of the Rhipsalis that have forms have extreme amounts of morphological variation. And I'm going to say that in most of the botanical texts that I've read, it calls out the fact that they actually only gave names to those of extreme forms, which means there's other like intermediate sort of morphological appearances. So in this particular slide, I actually put a lot of the teres plants that I have, and they are defined and characterized by the fact that they all have teres flowers. Here we can see one of the plants that I have. You can see that it has this kind of splay, you know, the little tiny branches of the big clusters of them coming off of the longer branches. Very, very typical. But then we also see sort of this kind of downward sort of branching growth, also very, very typical. You can see a big mess here of the kind of thing that it can do. But then here we see this plant had this kind of growth pattern where the branches were thinner than on heteroclada, on form heteroclada, considerably thinner, but it had that same sort of different branching pattern. And so here you can see a very clear, distinct difference between these two. And it's interesting because on form heteroclada, you could actually see that in one plant. And so here you see that there's kind of an interesting thing where you can see different plants presenting those same forms, which is just kind of crazy. Here you can see all these little berries that are forming here all over this plant. This plant's berries tend to be more pink than they are white. Here we see another one, and this one just looks like kind of a mess. You can see it seems like it's more pendant already. So again, it has all these little branchlets at the end there. And here you can see this one. Again, it's one that's going to get a lot of those little branches at the ends. It's going to be more pendant. Here you see another one where it kind of has this kind of clustering shape combined with this kind of clustering shape at the ends of those. So that plant is definitely just kind of a hot mess. Like that looks like a disastrous plant. But actually, that plant is the same plant as that plant, and it was just two different growing conditions. And even more interesting is that is actually another start of the exact same plant grown in very high light. And the reason why that plant's berries tend to be more pink is because it produces more betulins. So you can see how this is a very sort of reddish looking plant. And I want to point out that this guy started from cuttings. You can see that a lot of this growth has a lot of the little hair at the areoles and stuff, a lot of kind of presenting of juvenile, what we would call juvenile growth. And it eventually will just continue to grow out of that and create its more sort of mature growth. And you can see it's already here starting to throw out one of those long branches. And here you can see different flowers. It's got a very attractive flower, and in different light conditions, the flowers can kind of change. Like here, this flower is kind of more of a goldish color. Here, if you put it in very strong light, some of them, again, because they can produce those betulins, you can see that some of these buds are actually just outright pink. And in some cases, because of that, you can see that the flowers are not always just white or kind of gold. Sometimes they can actually get a pinkish hue to them. Whereas here you see the flowers, they're just kind of, they've got a little bit of a pinkish hue, but nothing quite as crazy. And here you can see another one. The clades on this one are a little bit different. That one is almost bordering on capilliformis, but the clades I think were still too thick to really be capilliformis. And that is actually the flower, which doesn't quite look capilliformis enough to me. And then here you can see some of those berries being a little bit more pink. But again, these guys can get super pink, magenta. And here you can see a different teres that I have. And this one is kind of almost bordering on form prismatica, but not enough, not quite. So just a ton of this kind of morphological variation here, and just teres just in general. And then here, if we look at form prismatica, this one's kind of crazy because this can, again, it can just go all over the place. So here you can see this one, it's got this sort of furry square branch segments that is characteristic of this plant. These ones are actually kind of short in some places, and here you can see they're kind of long in other places. And so that plant is actually the exact same as this plant. What happens here is that it kind of starts out like that, and then it was continuously producing these crazy, loony, long psycho branches. And the older the plant and more mature it has gotten, the crazier and crazier those branches have gotten. Like this right here is actually one long branch that it grew out, and then it just continues to grow those branches out at the end. Eventually, it reaches enough maturity that it just starts blooming almost year-round with all of these kinds of crazy little clusters of all of these blooms. And here is the thing that I was talking about very specifically before about your teres. Here, when we look at the ovary, you can see that the ovary there is shorter, typically, than the petal parts, and that's through most of the flower bud's development. I also noticed that these have this little tiny like outer, I don't know, you would call that kind of a back petal type thing. It's something that is very consistent that you notice on the ovary of the teres flowers. These flowers are very tiny. You can see they have a few, small amounts of stamen, but they actually still tend to have more stamen than the counterparts of some of the baccifera. So that's something. And then here you can see again, as this flower was dying, bright yellow. And then here you can see these actually are two berries from the exact same plant, just in different times. So you can see one of them is white and then one of them is more pink. Same thing, the berries here, they can be white all the way to like a very kind of deep magenta color. Here we see on some of the other ones that I have, some more prominent sort of like four-angled branching like that. Sometimes it's just a little bit more prominent than others. Sometimes here you can see that kind of growth pattern that I was talking about, that other kind of growth pattern that you sometimes see on all the different teres. Kind of interesting. That plant seems to, for the time being, had stayed a little bit more compact for the time being. Here is another one that, I don't know, the teres just kind of has a mind of its own. You can see that it had the typical sort of four-angled kind of growth with a little bit of the fur, and then I don't know what it was doing there. It was just doing something crazy. Here's one there that, again, kind of ran amok. They go a little bit bananas eventually. And there again, we can see a flower where the petals have recurved very, very strongly. And here we see Rhipsalis teres form capilliformis.
Capilliformis is a little bit hard to track down just because it was actually described considerably later than the other ones. So kind of interesting. This is the most common one that I see. This particular sort of growth pattern here. The branchlets are very thin. Again, you can see this same kind of branching pattern where it's got a long branch with a lot of these little branchlets at the end. This one can go pretty crazy on its branching. You can see that here on some of the growth on mine, I had what were like these little red scales. On some of the branch segments, you can see just how thin these really are. They're very, very thin little branches. Here you can see a flower as it's dying, turning bright yellow. You can see the ovary shape there. It's quite small. It's cylindrical. Here you can see it on the flower over here. And then you can see too that flower is turning yellow as it's dying. It's quite small, very, very small actually. And this particular one on that particular clone has kind of a like greenish yellow sort of flower color. Here is another one. Again, this is the little thing that I was talking about. It's like a little part of the ovary or a little tiny back petal type thing. It's on all of the teres. You can consistently see it on their flower buds and on the flowers. Here you can see the flower when it opened. They're so tiny. Those flowers are super, super tiny. Here we can see a white ripe berry coming off the end. And there we can see an unripe green one. Contrary to popular belief, these do not just flower solely out of the ends. Through maturity, they can actually start flowering up these like branches, these longer branches like this, up and down the sides of those. That's something that I read later in some of the like later botanical descriptions, them noting that. Here's a very young one, kind of looks like a chia pet. It looks at a young stage, could look potentially a lot like a lot of different species. And it's not something that you would see or be able to determine the identity of until it either flowers or it starts producing some of those like long branches with all of the little branchlets at the end. But there you can see that little tiny flower. And here again, you can see just how tiny they are. Now, there is another little one, and you can see that as it started to mature a little bit, we eventually get to see a little teres, a typical little teres growth come out of there. And here again, you can see just how narrow those branches are. And here you can see there's just the branches, the little branchlets that come off of these longer branches. Sometimes they're just so crazy. So these were like two different scenarios going on here. Really interesting. Here you can see that this one, I have to call this one form capilliformis because it in every way looks more like, and the flower just seems definitely more capilliformis than anything else, but is definitely a different clone. So you can see that this guy actually has this funky branching pattern that was kind of the other branching pattern, a little bit of a different branching pattern. But it has very, very, very thin branch segments, the same thing. It does grow these big long ones with the clusters at the end, but again, it seems to have that kind of secondary branching pattern. You can see some new things coming off there. Here, if we go over here, you can actually see how thin those little branches are, but you can also see that the growth pattern is ever so slightly different. And then you can see it's got a very typical sort of teres bud and everything. Everything about it is a very typical, like the flower part is a very typical sort of teres thing. Here you can see just how tiny the flower is. So it's very, very small. Same thing. This plant actually, the flower is a little bit more gold. I will say that this plant flushes quite red when exposed to sunlight. So obviously it was a clone that was producing more betalains. The flower is a little bit more gold appearing here. The ovary is obviously a little bit more colored, would probably have pink berries. Fun fact is that I actually found a picture of this plant in an old publication. And it was funny because it said Rhipsalis affinis Simmerly. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it was an old plant that was reduced under Rhipsalis serioscula eventually. But what was interesting is that I don't quite know why they thought that this plant looked anything like Rhipsalis serioscula. So it was kind of a weird read, but at the same time I was very excited to like see a picture of my weird little plant in a botanical publication. So very, very interesting. Here we have Rhipsalis baccifera, subspecies baccifera. Here's the thing is that this can actually produce some of these like quirky little things that are kind of similar to Rhipsalis teres. So there can be some taxonomic confusion there. I think that after seeing them grow, I'm confused as to why there is in some cases. I don't really see it for Baccifera subspecies Baccifera. But here you can see they, has kind of like long spaghetti-like branches. And you can see typical white Baccifera berries. Here's a different one. It can be quite elegant. It just kind of depends on how it's grown and the kind of clone, really. But it can be quite elegant. And here you see berries in differing stages. You can see that the dead flower tends to remain on the ends of these berries. It is something that is kind of an interesting characteristic. Here you can see with the Baccifera, it is actually the opposite for teres. So you can see that the flower ovary has a tendency to be considerably longer than the flower petaling parts through most of the bud production. So that is a way to be able to differentiate the two when sometimes it's a little bit confusing. And then you can see that as this flower is dying, you'll notice that it is staying more white. It's not really turning so yellow. And here again, you can see the flower ovary is longer than the petal parts there through the bud production. Here we can see a little flower. Again, I will call out the fact that it does not have very many stamen. Very small flowers. And there again, we can see that cute little round ovary. The ovaries tend to be considerably more round than they are like with teres. They're a little bit more like barrel-shaped, I guess. It's kind of hard to see because they are really tiny. But here again, we see kind of the pretty arrangement of flowers. It's got a little bit of a different arrangement of the flower petals there. But sometimes the flowers, I notice, look a little bit more like this, and sometimes they look a little bit more like this. And it's actually on the same plant. You'll see that kind of thing. So here we have Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies Cleistogamma. So the thing about this is that the only really important thing here is that the flowers are cleistogamous. And so what that means is that they actually self-pollinate before the flowers open. So the flowers on this species don't really open. And that is really how you're going to be able to tell what species it is. I don't really believe that it is that much different looking from subspecies Baccifera. So here, if we go to a link, this is actually the only picture that I've ever really been able to find of this. And so this would actually be a picture from a botanical publication. So in general, these flowers just would not really open. They would just form and then pollinate before ever opening and then just produce fruit. So that would be the way to determine that one. And then we have Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies erythrocarpa. So I bought this. I thought it was really interesting, and it has really, really elegant branches. I would say that they are more elegant than subspecies baccifera. They are a little bit different. They were quite thin. You can see that they have, it's hard to explain. They're just more attractive. That's just what I'm going to say. They're more elegant. They're more attractive. They're more flexible, pliable. So the thing to know about this particular species, how to tell this apart, these aren't really going to look that much different flower-wise or anything like that than your subspecies Baccifera. It is going to be small characteristics. So here, the unripe berries are actually a reddish color and they ripen to white. And so if we take a look here at some of these pictures, you can see the flower really does not look that much different from your typical baccifera flower, but you can see that those unripe berries are super red, and then they ripen to a white color. And here you see again, very, very, very red. And then you can see here, like as they're ripening from that red, they go through all these beautiful different stages of pink before they end up ripening to white. And then Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies horrida. And you can see again your very, very typical Rhipsalis baccifera flower. It's a very typical looking flower. And then you can see that the branch segments on these, they have a tendency to be furry, I guess. They have a lot of spines, a lot of hairs that actually grow out of the areoles. And so I don't have the best representation of this plant, sadly. But here is kind of a different representation that I wanted to show too, just because this plant, a lot of things were actually reduced under this, so it can have a lot of variation. So here is one that is kind of growing in a little bit of a kind of a kooky different way, kind of a little bit of a different looking clone there. And here you can see, all of the hairs coming out of the areoles. Different clones can produce more or less hairs, and sometimes as they age, the hairs actually kind of fall off. And one of the things that I've noticed about this is that when it gets a little bit more desiccated, it can tend to have a much more angular appearance in its branches than being like super duper round, but it typically produces a ridiculous amount of flowers out of the areoles, out of all those little areoles. And again, your very typical sort of baccifera flower and your very typical sort of berry, it will produce a huge abundance of those berries, and they pollinate quite naturally, so quite readily. And here we have Rhipsalis baccifera, subspecies marischiana. So marischiana is interesting because there's a lot of variation here, a ton of variation. And so one thing that I will say about this is that here, if we look at this particular plant, it has a tendency to look very strongly like your Rhipsalis teres forma heteroclada. And so this would be very easily confused with Rhipsalis teres heteroclada if it was not for your very typical baccifera flowers. So here you can see that in comparison to your form heteroclada, it has much less stamen. And all of the same things that we've already talked about for the other baccifera would remain true here. You can see that this flower dyed a little bit yellow, but it wasn't really bright yellow. It was a pale yellow. This plant confused me for a while because of that reason. But again, you can see a very typical baccifera form on the flower and a very small amount of stamen by comparison. And let me see. I was trying to find a flower. Oh, there was one right here. And again, here you can see the ovary is considerably longer than the petaling parts, the petal parts of the flower as that bud is developing, and it's that way through most of the development. Here are flowers dying on the same plants, and you can see that here they are more white. And then I wanted to point this out because it is something that I saw in botanical descriptions for, I think, some of the species, but it's not true that those are the only species that can have the reddish coloration around the areoles. Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies marischiana can also do that. Here's another one that has a strong tendency to behave that way. You can see the clusters of unripe green berries, and again, you can see the flower has a tendency to remain on the berry. Here you can see these ripened. In this case, they ripen to kind of a greenish white color. It's very attractive.
Here you can see, again, the reddish at the areoles, the reddish flush on the branches. And here you can see, again, strong resemblance, I think, to Rhipsalis teres form heteroclada. Here you can see, again, you know, again, we get that very long ovary in comparison to the petal parts of the flower. Very small flowers, different clone. You can see that the ovary, it's kind of a different color, I guess. It's kind of a tan color, and the flower is just ever so slightly different. But again, you very easily see the resemblance here. Do want to point out that here, this has a tendency to produce, I think, a lot of juvenile growth when it's first started. So you see all of these little branches with all these little hairs, and it eventually grows out of that. Like this plant right here actually started out like this. Just tons and tons of like hairy growth like that. Here you can see one of those greenish white berries as they were ripening, but you see all that juvenile growth that's in there. So it can look very, very different in a young stage. A lot of Rhipsalis are like that. They can look very different in a juvenile stage. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out about this is that it could have many, many different colors of berries. And so I found this amazing picture. Again, this is Wilhelm Barthlott's flicker, but you can see here tons of different berry colors for Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies marschiana. You see white, light pink, green, greenish white, kind of a darker pink, even kind of a reddish color. So Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies marschiana, here you can see that my hand being in there as well, it has thicker branch segments than the other species of baccifera. And then we have Rhipsalis ewaldiana. I have no idea if I said that right, but this plant has always been described as being very, very similar to Rhipsalis teres form capilliformis. But from my understanding, everything about it, the flowers should actually remain more white as they were dying. At one time, I think, again, before some phylogenetic testing, this was considered a subspecies of baccifera. So that should tell us kind of a lot. So I have found some pictures here. So if we zoom in on these pictures, you can see why they would say it has kind of a resemblance there. A couple of things that I will point out that I have noticed about this is the flowers, the dead flowers, again, remaining at the ends of the berries. I will say that these berries have kind of an elongated shape to them. And you can see that the ripe white berries, they're kind of like egg-shaped or teardrop shape. So it does seem a little bit different. There you can see a little tiny flower. And I don't know if we can make that out like in the background there, but it looks like a flower that has died or is dying and is still white. That is going to be probably your easiest way to tell these apart. But if we look really closely here at some of these, and I realize it's blurry and that these are kind of small, but you can sort of make out that the ovary of that flower bud is longer than the petal parts of the flower. And bloop. Here we can see one of the flowers. Again, I think that just when you look at this, you can see that the ovary part of this flower is very long. And you can kind of make out the baccifera shape, but this is very, very recurved. So it's a little bit difficult. You can see there's only a small amount of stamen here. Although that is also true for form capilliformis. And so there we can see the berry kind of up close. So kind of difficult to be able to tell those two apart, but I have seen like larger pictures of Rhipsalis ewaldiana where it showed more of the plant form. And I guess that what I would say is that it looks like the little branchlets that come off of the longer branches are considerably longer, but it also actually just kind of looks like a really, really disheveled idea of Rhipsalis terriform capilliformis. Like it's not so tidy and orderly. It's kind of crazy looking. But the only really way that you're going to be able to tell these, I think, is because there's so few pictures, is really just, again, those tricks about like the flower, the ovary, is it white when it's dying or is it bright yellow, is really the only way. And here we have Rhipsalis schaefferi. Again, this guy was at one time classified as a subspecies of baccifera before probably phylogenetic testing that had it changed. So the thing that I've noticed about this guy is that it does actually tend to look like baccifera in terms of it has kind of these long branch segments, although these do seem to be a more of a like determinate sort of length. They don't just keep on and keep on growing. So they seem to have like a set length that they grow each season. The branch segments seem thicker just in general. So here you can see with my hand in the picture, you can see how thick they are. I have noticed that there's something kind of an odd texture on these, which I think was captured here. You can see that there is like kind of a woody-ish type of appearance here on these branches. Like you can see that there's some cracking, almost like some peeling or something that's on the branches. It was just kind of an oddity that I noticed about this. The epidermis had an appearance of being like pale green. I don't know if that's a consistent kind of thing or not. You can see here that I had a flower bud, and again, you can see on this flower, the ovary was longer than the petal parts of the branches as it was forming. Sadly, I had to go on vacation and I missed that flower opening. It was a total bummer. But the flower really probably doesn't look very much different from your Rhipsalis baciferas. It probably is kind of similar. And I have seen pictures of the flower, so I know it's kind of similar, although I do know it looks just a little bit different. It should have the same characteristics, like it should turn white as it's dying. It doesn't turn bright yellow the way that teres does or anything. And here you can see the white berries. Here we have Rhipsalis mesembryanthemoides. Underrated Rhipsalis. It's actually really kind of interesting and fun to watch. It has this like dimorphic growing pattern again, where it's got like the long branches and then all these little tiny branchlets that run up and down those long branches. Really interesting and actually kind of a unique Rhipsalis if you really think about it. It's kind of strange because I'm like, it's amazing that's a Rhipsalis, to be honest, because it just looks so much different from all of the other ones. Here you can see it's really, really pretty. It's really attractive and elegant. It really is kind of an underrated Rhipsalis. Mine is really very close to a very strong grow light, so you can see that the epidermis is actually flushing kind of a reddish or kind of a pinkish color. It's really, really attractive. And here you can see the flowers from the field guide. Very attractive little flowers. Just kind of an oddity, kind of an odd Rhipsalis, I think. Stands out quite a bit. You really wouldn't have any difficulty identifying that one because it's so unique. Here we have Rhipsalis pentiptera. And Rhipsalis pentiptera is one that is typically pretty easy to identify. I think that, again, it's something where people kind of get it confused a lot with Rhipsalis micrantha form kirbergii or with Rhipsalis sulcata. But you can see that these branches here, with my hand in the picture, you can see that they're very stout. They're quite stout. They're nowhere near, they're like a lot thicker than the other two species. And I will point out here that the general sort of lobing pattern is a little bit different. This pattern it is a lot more consistently like this. The wings are considerably more prominent. Contrary to some things that I've heard, I've heard some mistakes about thinking that because the name is penta, that it actually has to have exactly 5 angles or 5 ribs on this species. That is not true. This species, I believe, can have somewhere like 3 to 5 angles. And I have seen some clones where it's actually, they have a lot of 3 angled. So again, it's just growing conditions, really. And, probably just kind of like clonal variation, different plants having different variations to some of that. So just an FYI on that. Tiny flowers. It has really small flowers. Here you can see that flower, I think, was maybe just over a centimeter, so it was actually pretty small. But it is really a cutie. It's really interesting. I remember when I very first got this one, I was not excited about it. It took me, it took watching it grow for maybe about a year before I was like, oh, I get it. I kind of like it. At first I was like, I don't like this plant. So here you can see just kind of how the new growth comes out. A different kind of characteristic that I think can really help differentiate it between some of the other species. You can see how this growth is actually coming out of a joint there. And here, it definitely looks different than I think how the growth actually starts growing out in some of the species that it could be confused with. Here we have Rhipsalis flagelliformis. This one is really a shocker. I think this is always kind of a shocker to see because it's like, wait a second, like that's not a Rhipsalis, but indeed they found a Rhipsalis that looked kind of like your Aporocactus flagelliformis and named it Rhipsalis flagelliformis. So here you can see on mine, I have different clones, and this clone seems to produce more like 4-angled growth. So that can seemingly be kind of variable. It's not a very slow growing plant, I don't think. I expected it to be slow, I think just because of, Aporocactus flagelliformis is kind of slow, but it's really not. This one tends to have more angles. You can see just how insanely crazy that grows. It's very, very strange plant. And you can see all of the hairs coming out of the areoles. You can see the little tiny flowers. And again, when we get into like the phylogenetics and you see the flower of Rhipsalis pachyptera, and then you look at the flower of Rhipsalis flagelliformis, knowing that they are very closely related, you can see just how strongly they resemble each other. So you can see very strong similarity just in the ovary, the whole flower, etc. So here you can see that it produces just an astronomically cool level of buds that actually form out of those areoles. Really cool. Here you can see these came out of the field guides, and you can see all those flowers all up and down there. And then, oh my goodness, look at those crazy town berries. Isn't that insane? That's just absolutely insane. So a very, very, very cool species. Would be very hard to confuse with any other Rhipsalis for sure. And here we have Rhipsalis pacheco-leonis, subspecies catenulata. And once again, the phylogenetic relationships, obviously this is very closely related, again, to Rhipsalis flagelliformis and Rhipsalis pentaptera. You can see it in their flowers. And this one is always mislabeled. People always call this Rhipsalis paradoxa minor. It's not very closely related to Rhipsalis paradoxa. So just so we know that. It obviously, it has long branches. These branches are actually of an indeterminate growth, meaning that these branches, you can see how long they are, and they're continuous. So here you can see these are very long. That's about how long it is. And it's just continuous. And you can see all of them are all different kinds of lengths. It just kind of depends. Some of them get very, very, very long. Here you can see a white berry that came out of one of the field guides. Here you can see some chaining, how intense that chaining is because it was grown under very, very strong light. And you can see the little hints of red at the edges of this branch segment because it was grown in very strong light. Here you can see more chaining, and here you can see when it was grown in a little bit less light, like how much less defined the chaining actually is there. Here you can see new growth. I always find the new growth here kind of fascinating as you see the chaining kind of coming out initially. Here you can see the flowers, little tiny flowers. The flowers can be, I think they would be determined kind of a pinky or kind of a browny color, just kind of depends. Like here you can see a different one. This one's kind of more of a very, very light baby pink with a little bit of gold. And this one has kind of a darker color. And there again, you can just see a little bit of reddish on the branches. Pretty easy to identify this one. Here we have Rhipsalis pacheco-leonis, subspecies pacheco-leonis. And once again, the reason why we know or what can really help us identify these is the flowers, the strong flower similarity between these. So typically this one has very pink flowers, but that's not always the case. It can also have flowers like this, where they are white and you can just see tiny hints of pink. It can have either pink or white berries. So here you can see pink berries on one from one of the field guides, but they could be pink or they could be white. Some of the interesting characteristics about this one is that you can see that it has the same kind of growth. So it has that same kind of long, indeterminate kind of branches, but the chaining on them is typically not as prominent. Now, the higher light it gets into, the more prominent the chaining will be, but it tends never to really be quite as prominent. But you can actually still see that pattern. You can still see the chaining pattern, the alternating of the areoles. You can still see it. It's just not a well-defined chain. Here you can see the new growth. And again, just like the other one, you can see the strong similarity of the new growth as it starts to emerge. This is actually something that's interesting because this particular species has a tendency to grow two distinct different types of growth. It will grow a growth that actually has a lot of bristles on it, a lot of tight angles. So here you can see it in the plant, but if we actually come very close to it, you can see here what that growth actually looks like. So it very distinctly has those two different types of growth, and it was actually described that way. Here you can see it again. Again, this was described as being this way. That was a different clone that I got from Germany. That is the one that has pink flowers and pink berries. And here you can see that when I initially got that, a cutting, it was desiccated. And so when it's desiccated, you can make out the chaining, a lot more prominent. You can also see that little ovary there being very pink. So fairly easy to identify once you really kind of see it and you understand it. I think that initially it can be a little bit hard to identify. And here we have Rhipsalis lindberghiana. And again, we see the same kind of characteristic, very, very similar sort of flower. It has indeterminate growth. Again, here if we go into the field guide flowers, you can see just how similar they actually look. Very, very similar. And there you can see unripe green berries. Here you can see ripe white berries. And like many of the other species we've looked at, it can have white or pink berries. It's very elegant. You can see that the branches, they're very long and they're very slender typically. they can be different widths. So like this particular clone of mine has very slender branch segments, but they can be a little bit thicker than that. Here you can see the new growth as it comes out. I think the reason why this is kind of an interesting characteristic is because it grows differently than some of the other species that it might resemble. Some of the other species from Rhipsalis, which we'll get to, but it definitely does look different. Here you can see some of my plants. You can see they grow very, very long. It's super duper elegant. Here you can see this one was so crazy long that I actually had to wrap it around the pot to take that picture. Here's one that is a little, a little bit kooky, but interestingly, you can see that same kind of odd upright growing pattern there before the branches fall down and start hanging. So very similar to what we just looked at with Rhipsalis pacheco-leonis. Here again, you can see some new growth. And then you can see these beautiful little flowers. My flowers on this particular clone were like a gold with a little bit of pink. And you can see how small they are. The flowers are very small, but it's very attractive. And so I think that to identify this one, honestly, it would be very, very, very long. It would have long, long continuous branches of indeterminate growth and lots and lots and lots of flowers up and down all these areoles like that. And the flowers do have a tendency here like that. You can see they kind of face downward a little bit. Not too much, just a little bit. But truly one of my absolute favorite species. Here we have Rhipsalis paradoxus, subspecies paradoxa. Probably one of the most recognizable Rhipsalis. So obviously has a very, very strong sort of chaining pattern. The branch segments on this one are very, very thick. You can see here with my hand in the picture, they're very thick. It has very large flowers. The flower buds are rampant. And so you can see a flower bud here that is just kind of poking out. It's interesting because it kind of has a little split there and it just kind of emerges out of there. It's all kind of weird looking. In a way, really. It is a little weird looking. Magnificent, magnificent flowers. They can be white. They can be tinted a little bit more pink. Very large. And then initially, they're kind of that more white or with a little bit of pink or whatever. And then as they die, they start to turn yellow. And the further along they get in dying, you can see here, they get more and more and more yellow. And they have white berries eventually. Here you can see an unripe berry. They typically kind of stay hidden because, again, that ovary is still a little bit more immersed in that branch. So typically they're a little bit more hidden until they ripen. There you can see those buds busting their way out. Super fascinating always to watch the flower buds there, but very easy to recognize Rhipsalis species. And here we have Rhipsalis paradoxus, subspecies septentrionalis, which is kind of like the smaller version, I guess, of Rhipsalis paradoxa. It is a little bit different, but you can see here in the overall plant morphology that it seems a little bit different, but I will say that what kind of makes it a little bit different is more along the lines that its branch segments are just thinner. So here with my hand in the picture, you can see that's considerably thinner, but what really is going on is that the other plant has more weight to weigh it down. Right now, this plant doesn't have as much weight, so you can see that it kind of bows out a little bit more. And exactly the same, which I actually should have covered here, but I didn't, is that these are not continuous. These are actually determinate. So these will only grow here to like a set length each season. They won't just continue to like grow really, really long. It sometimes just appears that way in pictures when you look at the plant. So here you can see it a lot more easily on this one. And they do both have that same pattern of growth. It's just that one is much thicker than the other. So septentrionalis tends to have flowers that are a little bit smaller, and they do tend to be a little bit more have a little more hints of color. So you can see here, this is a little more pink. You can see here, it's got like little hints of orange, a little bit more yellow there. And then as this one dies, it has a strong tendency to turn very, very, very yellow. So it's just a little bit darker than subspecies Paradoxa. There you can see some new growth coming out. Here you can see, again, the erumpent buds. Same thing, they're just busting their way out. There you can see one of the, it in full flower. It's really magnificent to see it flower. Here you can see the different shades there, them turning very yellow as they die. And in some cases, very, very, very yellow. Really beautiful. It's a really, really beautiful species. Here we see Rhipsalis pilocarpa, another one that's very easy to identify. So, you know, here you can see it's got, again, those kind of hairy branches that kind of hang down. It is really, really unique. So it's most confused usually with Rhipsalis baccifera subspecies horrida. Obviously, when they flower, they have very, very, very different flowers. So if you were super confused and you just waited for it to flower, these are obviously not the flowers of a baccifera. These are quite large. They're quite beautiful. You can kind of see with my hand in the picture there. I probably should have added a better picture to see how big those flowers are, but they are quite large. You can see even the ovary there has a lot of hairs on it. Sometimes the center of the flower here can be very red. And then here we see these absolutely gorgeous, large, also furry, pink or magenta berries. It's very, very attractive species. Here we have Rhipsalis camposportoana. This is really kind of the first of the ones with these kind of like long, very slender clades. This is one of my oldest Rhipsalis, so it's fairly large. It does a lot of really crazy blooming. You can see it's got those like white bell-shaped flowers, and then the stamen are reddish at the base. The flowers do not, on my clone, they do not really open very much. This is about as much as they actually open. So if you really want to see the stamen, you kind of have to really get in there and look at it. It has orange berries. There are some flower buds. They're generally green. I don't actually think that I've seen them be on any other color other than green. And there's about a general idea of the branch thickness there. So they're pretty thin, but it is also not the thinnest of all of them. I opened that flower to get that picture of those stamen. It's a very, very attractive species. I will say that it is very fast growing. It may not be the fastest blooming though. So, but it does readily produce the berries. So typically this might take a little while to identify because some species might bear a striking resemblance to this, especially when they're very young. Like this could be very confused with some clones of Rhipsalis teres form capilliformis, or it could be really, really confused with some other species that we'll get to shortly. Here we have Rhipsalis aurea. Rhipsalis aurea is a magnificent, magnificent plant. It's like, it's such a mess. Look at that. It's beautiful though. The way that it grows, and it's really kind of fascinating. It's like a big scribble. Here you can see about how thick those branches are. They're actually quite thin and elegant. You can see the flowers again, they form typically out of the ends. Not always, I've seen them form out of the sides of these branch segments too, but typically towards the end. They're bell-shaped. These are yellow, which is kind of a rarity in Rhipsalis. So here you can see some buds that were kind of forming in odd places. It's kind of an odd thing. But it's very, very attractive and very, very yellow. And here's a general idea about how big the flowers are. So they're a little bit over I would say just shy of 2 centimeters if you're looking at it this way. And lengthwise, it's about 1.5 centimeters maybe. Super, super attractive though. And it's just so fun to watch it grow. It's just kind of a different kind of crazy Rhipsalis. And here we have Rhipsalis pulchra. So I just have a little tiny plant of Rhipsalis pulchra here. And it kind of sort of looks a little bit like, I don't know how to explain. Like, I think it looks a little bit like Rhipsalis flacosa, I guess. Here you can see with my hand in the shot, you can see that the branch segments are actually, they're kind of medium, a little bit thick, a little bit thin. One of the interesting things that I noticed was about the new growth specifically. So the new growth you can see here, it's got like these little tiny scales that kind of protrude. And what was interesting is there was an old botanical sketch that I saw where it actually, they sketched those little scales coming off of those. So I thought that was kind of interesting. You can see the aerials. They do continue to have kind of like the little red scales, at least on this particular clone. There's really not that much to say about my plant just because it's so small, but here you can see from the field guides, you can see a larger plant, and so you can see that growth pattern kind of continues. Very long, very elegant sort of plant, very pendant. Here you can see some flower buds. I do want to call out the ovaries there on those flowers. You can sort of see how those ovaries look. They do not actually look like any of the ovaries on the flowers that are in Calamo-Rhipsalis, so any of the erumpent sort of flowery ovaries, they don't really look like that. They actually here in this picture look a lot like the ovaries of something like Rhipsalis burchellii. Here you can see again, these ovaries are visible. They're not really partially hidden or fully hidden. And there you can see the kind of bell-shaped flower. Here you can see very specifically call out that the stamen are yellow. These flowers can be more white like this, or they can be more purple or magenta. Here you can see the berries there. They're kind of a, I guess, kind of a light pink color. And here we have a link to a more colorful flower. So here you can see the flowers can be a lot more pink or magenta, very elegant, very pretty flower buds. Just a very, very attractive sort of, you can see those very interesting ovaries there, but it's a very, very attractive plant. Not one that we see very often in the United States either. And here we have Rhipsalis burchellii. So Rhipsalis burchellii actually boasts the thinnest of all of the branch segments. You can see with my hand in the picture here that they're quite thin. It is, or can be, very, very difficult to tell the difference between this and Rhipsalis campos portorana without like real deep knowledge of how to tell them apart. Here you can see how thin and elegant those branch segments are. My plant tends to blush very reddish, has a lot of betulins. I think that's actually pretty common for Rhipsalis burchellii. I don't think it has to be that way, but I think it's pretty common. Here you can see the new growth on my plant was always pink. You can see the flower buds emerge. They were always pink. And there you can see the flower. You can see the ovary here on mine had maintained kind of a pink color. That doesn't mean that it would have to be, but for the most part, I do notice that it is. Here you can see the stamen, very similar. They're kind of a reddish, orangish color at the base. And here are some different plants that I purchased from Andy's Orchids not so long ago. You can see it always has those big long, will produce those big long shoots, very typical for this particular subgenus. So here we can go to this link to go look at berries. Here you can see the berries might be this kind of very bright magenta or reddish color. I have seen them be kind of a paler pink before, though. We have Rhipsalis cereoschula. So cereoschula, it tends to have these short kind of furry branches like this. It will quite commonly be mistaken for Rhipsalis teres form prismatica when it doesn't have flowers, but these they're not usually square, and you can see how much shorter they are. They actually remind me of balloon animals. They just look like little balloon animals to me. Little furry balloon animals. But you can see like maybe they're a little bit square, but they're definitely not as square as Rhipsalis teres form prismatica. Not typically anyway. Here you can see where some of them are a little bit longer. Now obviously it does get those kind of long the long basal branches like that with these little tufts of branches at the end. Growth pattern is ever so slightly different. You can see here, beautiful flowers. Absolutely love these flowers. Mine has a tendency to produce kind of pinkish flowers. They just have a hint of pink, but typically they're just kind of white flowers. But it's a really, really attractive shape. And just lots and lots and lots of little flowers off those ends. Here you can see my berry was kind of a white color. I imagine these berries could also be kind of a pink color. Here we have Rhipsalis ormondoi, another one that's not seen very often. You can see here it has these kind of clades where they're a little bit club-shaped at the end, kind of reminiscent of Rhipsalis clavata. Key distinct difference is that it has a tendency to produce these long basal branches like this. Rhipsalis clavata would very, very, very rarely do that. Here you can see my plant as some of the growth is coming out. I think how it's kind of changing a little bit. It's a very attractive, very, very elegant looking plant. I will definitely say that for it. It grows really well so far. Here you can see the flowers. They are these white bell-like flowers. The ovary on these flowers is always pinkish. That's one of the ways in which people can typically sort of tell it apart. It always has a very kind of pinkish ovary. But flowers considerably more like that of Rhipsalis clavata. Again, the most distinct way that you're going to be able to tell those apart is definitely going to be the abundance of long basal branches. The plant Rhipsalis ormondoi has a generally different sort of overall morphology. And here we have Rhipsalis jungeri, another one that is just not seen very often in the United States. However, I did eventually determine that this plant that came from Andy's orchids, this kind of unknown plant, was Rhipsalis jungeri. So here we can see the flowers. Again, we have those white bell-like flowers. A distinct and different characteristic about this flower is the fact that the stamen at the base are yellow. Here it can have these kind of red berries or dark maroon berries, but it can also have berries that are a transparent green that are red at the apex like that. So two kind of oddly distinct and different colored berries on this particular species. So some of the clones that I have picked up have been completely and totally solid green like this. These were the ones I think that I had struggled with at first. They're fine now. They're growing and stuff. So here you can see these guys. And you can see how something like Rhipsalis jungeri here, specifically like this photo, how these could be very, very confused with like something like your Rhipsalis campospotuana. But because it is typically quite rare in cultivation, it's not necessarily something that you're going to even really think of in terms of a possible identification. Here you can see too, it can produce these little branches where they're sort of clavata-ish at the ends. And here, for example, this looked a whole lot like Rhipsalis ormondoi, actually. I thought it was Rhipsalis ormondoi until I saw the berries. But you can see some of the kind of odd, just like the general odd sort of growth. But again, you know, we get like those big long basal branches like this, which is super not typical. None of that growth is typical of a Rhipsalis clavata. So mine kind of produced this big mess of whatever at the end, my original one. So it was kind of interesting. It's a really attractive plant. And I think that at first it only seemed kind of difficult to grow at first. I'm seeing that over time it seems to be considerably easier than I thought. Here we can get a better idea sort of the flower and those yellow stamen. And there again, a berry. Appears very strongly though that it has a strong tendency to be able to produce a lot of those betulins. So because some of the plants that I picked up were very, very strongly red, had a strong flush of red like this one. Here we have Rhipsalis clavata, forma delicatula. Now, almost all information that I have seen has pointed to this form being delicatula, where the branch segments were actually a little bit longer and a little bit thinner. Although there is an article that I read recently by Nigel Taylor, which made me wonder if these weren't backwards, but most of the information that I have has it this way. So again, this is one of those things where it's like, well, you know, it would need considerable more research to sort of determine whether or not these are or aren't backwards. But here you can see the flowers. Again, it has these white bell-like flowers. You can see the stamen here are completely white. They aren't colored like many of the other species. Here you can see this is one of my mature plants. What this plant is lacking is, and it's interesting because in the article by Nigel Taylor, he talks about that. It's just lacking those indeterminate sort of basal shoots the way that most of the other species in this particular subgenus have. Here you can see these little ends. So the little characteristic sort of ends, they look like little nail heads. They just sort of flare out at the end. That's how this plant got its name. Here you can see the buds. And there gives you a general size of how big those are. And typically, even into maturity of these, you can still see that they do maintain a little bit of that sort of flaring out. And then here you can actually see the berries. Berries typically white with that reddish sort of apex. And then here we see Rhipsalis clavata, forma clavata. Again, there's a potential that these were backwards, but the really big difference between these is that this one has a tendency to produce these like shorter, kind of fatter, clumpier type of clades. You can still see that there is a little bit of the clavate ends to these clades, but that's not always the case. Particularly on this one. Sometimes you get like this kind of thing where it's just kind of not really missing. It's missing that sort of flare at the end. The flowers are pretty much, they look really close to the same. I've noticed just kind of small differences in the ovary being maybe a little bit bigger here. This plant obviously was producing some betulins. So you can see here it would flush extremely red in the sun. Very, very attractive when it does that. You can see, you know, a little bit of the pink there. But generally you can just see that the clades are kind of different. Like here you can see it's kind of missing those sort of clavate ends to some degree. And there you can see it just kind of keeps a shorter, clumpier appearance. One thing that I have noticed specifically about this plant is that it is slower growing, a lot slower growing. You can see no difference there. Stamen also white. Just kind of very clumpy. Very, very attractive. And here we have Rhipsalis dismilis, Formis dismilis. Now, while this can look really, really close to Rhipsalis trigona, it makes sense because the two plants are so closely related. But a couple of key differences here is that we can see that this actually has a tendency to produce multiple flower buds per aerial, which is very different from how Rhipsalis trigona is. Here you can see multiples. Here you can see the flower is about 2.5 centimeters, quite large, tends to have more petals. Mine on this are always very well formed. They're very attractive. Here you can see how some of the branch segments like that's not really triangular. It's got more like alternating angles. It's something that you actually see on the plant that it was thought to be most related to, which was Rhipsalis dismilis form epiphyllanthoides. Here you can see that the branches, while they do kind of, a lot of them are triangular, it's a very soft kind of triangle, and some of them are more round than anything else. Here you can see a big cluster of flowers. Very, very attractive on the flowers. It also has a tendency to produce growth like this, which has these little, again, like little hairs. It can actually produce long branches like that with a lot of hairs on them. It can get a little bit crazy looking. Here you can see these beautiful berries. They're kind of a pinky color. Here you can see a flower that as it's dying, it's actually kind of an orangey yellow. And here we really aren't gonna look at anything for Rhipsalis flacosa, subspecies flacosa, mostly because I have never been able to find a accurate picture of it in any botanical text. So it would pretty much just be collecting plants and going over the descriptions. Like I said, I have multiple different clones of this, and some of them are field collected, so they do have identifiers to them. But I'll need to wait for them to flower to be absolutely positive of kind of what's going on there. So when that happens, I'll update this slide. Here we have Rhipsalis flacosa, subspecies Pulvingera. We aren't going to get into the Rhipsalis flacosas too much just because I think that there is some confusion there. But some of these we can at least go to pictures that I know are correct pictures. You can see it's got a quite large flower. And you can see the branches there, I would say, are kind of medium, kind of a medium thickness. They are determinate, so they do have that kind of set length to them. It's very, very attractive. But these do have a strong tendency to be very hard to identify. And you can see here, you know, strong relationship, you know, based off of like the phylogenetics and everything, you can see a very sort of strong relationship with like Rhipsalis trigona, Rhipsalis dismilis. Here we have Rhipsalis flacosa, subspecies Hohenoensis. Now, the most important thing about this, the most identifiable characteristic is, of course, through this whole entire thing where we've talked about, you know, phylogenetics and the plants being related,
everything about this is going to look like a Rhipsalis flacosa. So nothing about that is really going to change. They're all going to have like the determinate sort of branches. They're all going to be kind of round with the raised podaria. So that just means it's going to have kind of a bump around its areola, really. They're all going to have erumpent flower buds, etc. So they're still flacosa. They're still recognizable as flacosa. But this one has a very, very yellow flower bud, and that carries through in the flower. So here I found some pictures, some accurate pictures. And so here you can see, obviously, the flower petals, the edges of the petals, they're extremely yellow. And that, you know, on the ends and the bud would be very, very yellow for that reason. A quite large flower again. And you can see the resemblance there. Here is from a botanical text, very yellow flower buds. You can see the branches. Again, you know, that determinant kind of thing. And we get these kind of pinkish berries. And you can see the fur at the areoles there. And behind the flower, even though it's kind of blurry. Here we have Rhipsalis trigonoides. Now, this was recently changed. The name of this was recently changed. So this was Rhipsalis trigona. And it was changed to Rhipsalis trigonoides simply because Rhipsalis trigona, what was described, was not actually this plant. So it was kind of complicated, but there is a big article about it for why the name was changed. So here you can see that this got its name because these branch segments, they're triangular. Like if you were to cut them like this, you would see an almost perfect triangle like that every time. I have never seen this plant produce anything other than triangular growth, as opposed to maybe something like Rhipsalis dismilis, Forma dismilis. The angles on this one, they have a tendency to be very sharp in terms of like the edges. They aren't like duller rounded the way that they would be for something like Rhipsalis dismilis. Another thing that I've noticed about this that is somewhat different is that when this bud actually starts to emerge, much like Rhipsalis paradoxa, it actually is more like a cat's eye and kind of comes out of a split like that. It's a little bit different. It almost always produces one flower per areole. I have actually never seen it produce two. My flowers always have a tendency to be a little bit messy, like they're never formed very beautifully. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but it's kind of true. Like they always look like that, a little disheveled, I guess. They are quite large. They are, I think, about like 2 centimeters large or larger, maybe even 2.5. So they are fairly large flowers. They are very attractive. Here you can see the new growth emerging there. You can see the kind of funny curl there where, because this is in the subgenus Calomorrhipsalis, it does have these erumpent flower buds. Now, something weird might happen there where like these might get turned into their own species, but this plant actually has a strong tendency to have two different distinct kind of appearances morphologically here. So you might get one that's like this, which has much longer branch segments like that, and then they will have a lot of this kind of like furry growth that grows out of the ends of those. You will notice that unlike Rhipsalis pacheco-leonis, subspecies pacheco-leonis, it does not actually tend to display the like a chaining pattern on the branch segments. I'm sure that if it was desiccated, it might, but for the most part, they tend to be round. Those two plants get confused quite a bit because they both have this kind of like furry growth, a dimorphic kind of growth pattern. So you will have those like that, But then there's a completely different kind of form here, which I think is supposed to be kind of a juvenile form. It's very interesting, where the branch segments do not get long. They actually stay this kind of short. They're short like this. And here you can see it's really, really interesting. It's like, what? Why are these short like this? One of my plants was actually grafted just because I broke the tip off. It was actually this little piece right here that broke off and then was grafted. And so that little piece is now right here. And so that's my little plant now. But you can see how these are just kind of staying shorter. But it is still and will still produce those little like hairy growths, I guess. Here you can kind of see a different one. There's kind of a little hairy growth. It's kind of funny, but there's some new growth. And so here, if we go look at these beautiful pictures, here we can see a plant. You can see the berries there. You can see it's got a really large, gorgeous sort of yellow flower. Really, really beautiful. But you can see that sort of like those short branch segments, which is very, very interesting. But this flower here, between that particular plant that grows more like this versus the one that grows like that, they have pretty much identical flowers, which is why they're classified as the same species. So, again, it's just one of those issues where when you're talking about like environment and how it might actually change the appearance, but it's still really the same species. So here you can see some new little growths coming out on this guy. One of my favorites, just because I think it has like the most remarkable flower, and I really, really like this particular plant. Here we have Rhipsalis tucumanensis. And so again, this used to be classified as Rhipsalis flacosa subspecies tucumanensis, but one of the interesting things is I think that after looking at Rhipsalis flacosa subspecies pulvingangera and Rhipsalis flacosa subspecies hohenauensis, I think that now that we look at this flower, we can see that there was something kind of distinctly different about it, which, really kind of helps to see like, oh, maybe it wasn't as closely related. And I think that the phylogenetics kind of showed that because it was kind of not really in the same grouping, it seemed like it was probably its own species or warranted species status. And so it has a really large flower, probably about 2 centimeters. That's not the thing that's like crazy about this one to me, though. What's crazy about this one to me is that it has these gigantic berries. There are these gigantic white berries. So here you can see unripe. There you can see it's starting to ripen. And it just kind of continues going until it ends up being just a gigantic, gigantic berry. So here you can see with my hand in the picture, you can see about how wide the branch segments are. Here you can see a flower bud, and while you might think that that flower bud is yellow, they're not. They're actually kind of a greeny color. This very characteristically had these little, the back petals are tipped with a little bit of pink. That's something that was described in their botanical descriptions. That is not always the case, though. Up here, there's a different clone that I have that seems to have more, I guess, like kind of creamy colored flowers, and has less of that whole pink thing. Here you can see just how much wool came out of the aerial. Again, these are erumpent, the flower buds, so once the flower bud came out, it released a whole bunch of this wool that is inside of the aerial, so kind of fascinating. A very attractive plant. I happen to have 2 different clones. This one has a different kind of epidermis.
So one of these is kind of a shinier color. It's smoother. This one is kind of a duller color. And it kind of has a little bit of a rougher texture, I guess you would say. Here's just how big those berries are. They are truly gigantic berries for a Rhipsalis. They're really interesting. They taste kind of nice too. Here's one as it was not ripe, but you can see the end here is actually rimmed with that maroon, which is why a lot of the times as the berries ripen, you can see just the apex is kind of reddish, maroonish, or pinkish colored. There you can see the new growth as it comes out. I always find the new growth to be kind of interesting and an interesting identifier. Here you can see after it has come out, it always kind of seems to have these large red scales. There you can see the plant and you can see all of the, once the fruit falls off, you're just left with like a crater full of wool at the areoles. Very attractive plant though, and it does bloom a lot. It has probably been continuously producing blooms for probably about 7 months at this point. So definitely likes to flower. More continuously, it's not like one gigantic flush. It just kind of continues and continues. I do want to point out that this can also get that juvenile kind of growth. So it can produce these kind of furry branch segments like that on occasion. You can see here, some of those are a little bit desiccated, so you can actually sort of see the ribs a little bit. And Rhipsalis flacosus subspecies Oreophila should actually look very close to Rhipsalis tucumanensis. I would not be surprised if something weird happened here and it taxonomically the name changed or it became its own species as well. It would look very similar, but I think that the branch segments are actually smooth. Again, I've never seen any picture of this species in any botanical text where it actually showed a flower, so we don't really have anything concrete or accurate to go off on that one other than the botanical description. Here we have Rhipsalis puniciodiscus. So as we looked at the beginning, I just want to call it out and point it out again, is that the stamen for this particular species, they could be like this sort of beautiful reddish purplish color, or they can actually be a yellowish sort of color. So just definitely want to call that out here. You can see this does actually grow very, very long, very beautiful branches of indeterminate length. So these get very long. It is very beautiful, very, very elegant plant here. You can see that a lot of times a very common characteristic for this species is that it has these sort of like dark reddish areas around the areoles, but as we've seen, it's clearly not the only species that does that. Quite a few of them do, but it is something that seems to help identify this one, especially because the branches are also shiny. They have a strong tendency to be shiny. They can be different thicknesses. Like this particular plant of mine, the branches are a lot thinner, which we can see here. They're considerably thinner, and again, you can see how dark green and shiny they are. But then this one that I have, the branches are considerably thicker. And you can see here, they're just considerably thicker and maybe not quite so shiny. Here you can see too, just want to point it out, the fact that there you can see some of that furry, kind of juvenile growth. It's something that a lot of Rhipsalis can do that. Here you see the very common characteristic of these. So because the new growth actually forms, because the areole is actually kind of immersed in the branch, the tips of the branches will get stuck a lot and it forms these kind of loops. Very, very, very common for this species to do that. Here you can see a flower bud there. Again, these are erumpent, and so after you'll see these giant craters that will be left on the branches after flowering.
there's a little loop. It's always really interesting to see those loops form. Here you can see berries. So it just gets these very sort of like orangey or kind of orangey yellow berries. Here we have Rhipsalis holleri, and Rhipsalis holleri, which I actually really never thought much about the berries of Rhipsalis holleri. I think mostly because we tend to focus on the flower because it's unusual in the fact that it's colored. But the berries of Rhipsalis holleri are also kind of orange. I didn't know that. They're maybe like a darker orange. Maybe you might even call them like an orangish reddish color. So very interesting. You can see also the branch segments of indeterminate growth. They can get very long. Here you can see how some of the new growth might actually emerge. Here you can see, of course, the most characteristic thing is the beautiful sort of purplish or I guess magenta kind of fuchsia flowers. They're very small, but they're very attractive. There you can see the buds. You can see them emerging. They're erumpent again. Here we can see over here. You can see how it's actually mostly developed underneath the epidermis before it kind of breaks through. You can see just how small the flowers are, just over a centimeter. And there you can see the branches are actually really very thin. A really elegant, really beautiful species, just gorgeous, gorgeous flowers. Here we have Rhipsalis nevis armandii, form megalantha. Now, here is the big thing about this particular species. Like, you can see just how beefy these branch segments are. They're extremely beefy. So that is like very, very easy to sort of discern between most other things. The thing that this would be most commonly confused with, I think, are some clones of Rhipsalis grandiflora. You can see that it too also kind of gets the darkening at the areoles, so that's not, even though it may have been part of their botanical descriptions, it's not necessarily characteristic of being able to identify the species alone. You can see here new growth, just how much you can sort of see the reddish on the branches, the red at the areoles. Here you can see when new growth emerges. You can see here it kind of getting stuck a little bit and looping. Again, because it starts to form here, you can see it starts to form sort of underneath the surface of the branch and then busts through and gets stuck and does some weird loopy stuff. So it's a very good characteristic of being able to help identify this is just based off of the kind of weird way that the new growth starts to form. A very, very different appearing from like your Rhipsalis grandiflora. It's definitely unique. Also boasts the largest flower of any Rhipsalis. The flower here is, mine usually range, I think, probably about like 3.5 centimeters up to 4 centimeters, but it is definitely kind of a show-stopping flower. We can see here that the buds actually form almost entirely underneath the epidermis of the branch segments, and then you can see they bust through. It will leave gigantic craters on the branches post-flowering. Here you can see that even though this flower is completely emerged, what you don't really see is the areole. Or what you don't really see is the ovary of the flower, because it's actually still just buried down here inside of the branch. You can see, of course, the beautiful orangish pinkish colored stamen. Super, super, super attractive. You can see that sometimes you'll have more petals, and then sometimes like this, you'll have less petals. That sometimes just happens.
Just depends on how much energy the plant actually had. Here you can see, I do want to point out, because again, you get this sort of hairy, sort of juvenile growth that appears here. Quite common for this plant to do that. And there you can see just kind of the like normal kind of growth habit. And then we see Rhipsalis nevis armandii, form nevis armandii. Very, very similar to megalantha. It's just that the branch segments are a lot less thick. So you can see they're very narrow. And so unlike Rhipsalis puniciodiscus, these branch segments have a determinate length. So you'll still see like the darkening at the areoles here and everything, but you'll notice that these are short, so they don't just keep growing and growing and growing the way that Rhipsalis puniciodiscus will. Here you can see a kind of a different clone. That one right now is maybe a little bit more upright. You can see that the flowers, they can have these orange-pink stamen, or they can have these kind of yellow stamen. You can see the new growth as it emerges in the same kind of strange alien way, can get stuck sometimes, can form loops. You can see that post-flowering, we have the large crater in the branch, and you can see the wool that was behind the flower emerges. Here is kind of an example of, I guess, the branching pattern a little bit. There you can see that branching pattern. That's a different clone, the one with the yellow stamen. So even though you can see that maybe the petals here, like the shape, maybe a little tiny bit different, but again, still they're the same species. The flowers are so very, very similar that they're still just classified as being the same species. It's not even a different form or anything. There you can see some more of those craters. And there you can see an erumpent flower bud. You can see it almost fully formed and then breaking through. And then here you can see the berries. This is actually the berry from the yellow clone. This is the berry from the one with the orange and pink stamen. I do notice that the yellow clone one seems to produce berries very readily, where the orange pink stamen one does not. That one only really produced that berry when it was outside because it had been pollinated by something. Here you can see an unripe green berry. And there you have it. Those are all of the currently accepted Rhipsalis species names. I will definitely be like publishing this, turning it into a PDF and making it absolutely and totally fully available, along with this document, which actually I should have opened this. So if we go to this document, it didn't have just Rhipsalis. It actually had a lot of these small flowering epiphytic cacti species. So here you can see the genus Rhipsalis, and then you'll see the genus Lepismium and all of the different flowers and all of the different recognized species. Phyphra, Hadiora, Limonbensonia, Pseudorhipsalis, and Gymnotia. So it's a publicly shared document, and you don't need to save those documents. Like you can save, I would save a link to those documents because I do regularly update them. So like as things flower, I'll regularly update and add pictures. And so it's totally open to use as a reference for identification for your own purposes. So I hope that you've enjoyed going through all of the Rhipsalis with me. I know that there's a lot of them, and just, you know, basically understanding sort of identification and how to be able to tell who's who, I guess. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.